"You're a witch! Admit it! You're a witch!" screams a woman at a young girl who's been handcuffed to a kitchen table for over 2 years. 2 other children cower in the corner, unaware that they're about to be ordered to do the unthinkable to this girl, their own sister. But they don't have a choice. Cruelty is all they know. They've been born into a house of pure evil. To make matters worse, the perpetrator of the violence is the mother of all the children. A woman who is arguably the most infamous and hated mother in all the annals of American criminality. Her cruelty to her kids was almost beyond belief. It scaled the outer limits of human depravity, and she is still alive today. Her name is Teresa Jimmy Francine Knorr, and this is her story. Let's look at what happened to Teresa herself when she was young. She was born Teresa Jimmy Francine Cross on March 12, 1946, in Sacramento, California. Her dad, Jim, was an assistant cheesemaker at Sacramento's Golden State Dairy. Her mom, Swanee, worked at a lumber yard, operating a pencil-making machine. Teresa had an elder sister, Rosemary, and 2 older step-siblings as well, William and Clara Tapp, who were from Swanee's first husband. Teresa was known in the neighborhood as being something of a loner, only ever appearing happy when at her mother's side. So when her mom suddenly collapsed one day on her way to the local store with Teresa in tow, Teresa's world quickly crumbled. Witnesses said they saw Swanee lying on the ground in Teresa's arms. On March 6, 1961, Swanee was buried at Sunset Lawn Cemetery. Teresa would never be the same again. With no source of income, Jim had to sell the house. Teresa and her sister's domestic bliss had turned into a nightmare. But it wasn't the poverty that troubled Teresa, it was the loss of her mom. She needed to fill that space that had been taken up with her mother's devotion to her. So it's not surprising that she jumped into the arms of the first guy she met. His name was Clifford Clyde Sanders, a man 5 years her senior. On September 29, 1962, Teresa, now 16, and Clifford were married, and she became Teresa Jimmy Sanders. She dropped out of school, and the two moved into a small apartment in North Highlands, a suburban area in Sacramento County, California. The marriage was not one made in heaven, though. They barely knew each other. They dated just a matter of weeks before they said their wedding vows, and the "until death do us part" bit was about to become very significant. Young woman, almost pathologically possessive of Clifford, not allowing him much freedom. They argued constantly, but despite not getting along, on July 16, 1963, their first child was born, Howard Clyde Sanders. At the beginning, this new addition to the family was mostly a joy, but Teresa's possessiveness soon reared its ugly head. As the baby cried, the couple spent many of the days screaming at each other. Clifford's family later said that he would have likely left her had Teresa not become pregnant again. Now, with another child on the way, they had to leave their one-room apartment and move into a house in Galt, Sacramento. Money was always an issue. Teresa and Clifford were often seen arguing about it, as well as his alleged infidelity. And on June 22, 1964, one of those arguments spun out of control. Rather than doing his duty of taking care of the kids, Clifford went out drinking with his friends all day. When he arrived home, worse for wear, Teresa launched into a tirade about him being unfaithful to her, which she would later say resulted in him punching her in the face. She filed a report against him for assault and battery, but later the charges were dropped when she refused to sign the papers. On July 5, 1964, the frayed relationship ignited again. It was Clifford's birthday. Teresa, still pregnant with her second child, didn't want him to go out drinking. She was sure he was cheating on her, and she let it be known. Whether he really was cheating is not certain, but the accusations were enough to compel him to leave her. He packed his bags, swearing to never return. He didn't get far. On his way out the door, Teresa picked up a rifle and shot him, killing him almost instantly. Police Chief Walter Froelich was one of the first on the scene. Teresa swore it was self-defense. "I grabbed a gun to make him keep from hitting me, and it went off," she protested. Teresa was arrested and taken to Sacramento County Jail. Her son Howard was sent to stay with one of her relatives. On July 7, 1964, the Sacramento Bee Daily newspaper reported Clifford Sanders, 23, was slain yesterday morning in the couple's small Galt home. Investigators reported the bullet apparently grazed off his left wrist and lodged in his heart. In the subsequent trial, Teresa's attorney argued that Clifford had been a violent drunk who'd often used his fists to settle arguments. This just didn't ring true to some of the people who knew the couple. According to them, Clifford was not a violent man. On the stand, Clifford's sister, Lydia Hanson, testified that it was actually Teresa who was the problem and Clifford the victim. She said Teresa was incredibly possessive and jealous. She testified that Teresa would rather kill Clifford before letting any other woman have him. She told the jury, "I believe with all my heart that Teresa Sanders planned to kill my brother." Deputy District Attorney Donald Dorfman wanted a first-degree murder conviction. He was sure that Teresa had killed Clifford in cold blood, a result not of domestic violence, but because she was pathologically jealous and prone to outbursts of fury. Teresa's attorney, Robert Zarek, said that his client had only acted in self-defense, protecting herself and her unborn child from an abusive man. Yet, when Dr. Arthur Wallace took the stand as the first witness for the prosecution, he said Clifford had no alcohol in his blood when he was killed. This contradicted Teresa's story of her drunk husband attacking her. The doctor explained that it was highly likely Clifford was shot when his hands were up in front of his chest, as if trying to protect himself, which would explain how the bullet first grazed his wrist. Teresa took the stand on her own behalf and delivered a tearful testimony, moving the jury with her stories about her violent alcoholic husband. Friends and relatives of Teresa also took the stand in her defense. A mental health counselor, Dr. Leroy Walter, said Teresa had been an anxious wife and after the shooting was remorseful. In his closing remarks, Dorfman said, "Don't be fooled, this was cold-blooded murder." He told the jury not every murderer can look like the witch in Snow White. She is 18 and pregnant, but that doesn't overcome the fact that she maliciously shot and killed her husband without provocation. Despite the prosecution having a strong case, Teresa was acquitted on September 22, 1964. She was, after all, pregnant, and there was also the other child to think about. The jury may have sympathized with Teresa at a time in history when domestic violence was quite common. Only in hindsight do we now perhaps conclude that Clifford might have been the victim here. Meanwhile, Teresa was about to embark on a lifetime of inhumanity. The severity of her crimes so intense, her manipulative behavior so in tune with a personality disorder, it's hard to believe her tearful tales in court were the truth and nothing but the truth. On March 16, 1965, Teresa, now a free woman, gave birth to a girl, Sheila Gay Sanders. This bundle of joy that came screaming into the world would leave it screaming too, but that's a story we'll get to in due time. Teresa was not an ideal mother to Howard and baby Sheila, to say the least. While pregnant, she had taken to heavy drinking. She often headed to the local American Legion Hall to drown her sorrows and flirt with men. She was known for her attractiveness, and she certainly had a way with the guys. It's believed that she was exceptionally manipulative and possibly endowed with a narcissistic personality disorder. One thing for certain is, when her good looks would fade in the future, she would lose her power to attract men, and her bitterness would become a deadly malignancy. Teresa met her ideal man during a drinking session at the Legion Hall when she bumped into Estelle Lee Thornsberry, a U.S. Army veteran. Estelle was insecure and needy of love, and Teresa was there to exploit that need. He had a serious swimming accident 2 years earlier, which left him a quadriplegic. Now wheelchair-bound, he met Teresa, who, unlike many women, didn't seem to mind his disability. For Teresa, finding a man who wasn't as mobile as most and had to literally look up to her was a match made in heaven. Estelle was smitten at the start of the relationship, so when the opportunity arose to move in with a pretty young woman, despite her having 2 kids, he grabbed the proverbial bull by the horns. They soon rented a small apartment together. Teresa helped him do all the things that were difficult for a man in a wheelchair, and at night they'd lie in bed, talking about their hopes and dreams. But she soon started to take advantage of the fact that it was difficult for him to get out of the house. She left him at home almost every night of the week with the 2 kids. He essentially became her live-in babysitter. She'd come home each night drunk, ignoring his entreaties about her behavior. Worse, after a few months of this, he found out she was sleeping with his best friend, one of the friends he'd really depended on after the accident. He couldn't begin to contemplate just how cold she'd become. Then, one night after another argument, she packed her bags, filling them with many of his belongings, and left him, broke and broken. In hindsight, he was probably fortunate the relationship ended sooner rather than later. After all, he could have ended up like Clifford. But Teresa didn't waste much time finding another man to move in with. On one of her many drunken nights out, she met Robert Knorr, a private in the Marine Corps. Yet again, the relationship seemed to move too fast. She confessed her undying love to him, and he, similarly entranced, returned her affection. She was, after all, a real beauty. Within a few months of dating, she was pregnant again, and the two started talking about marriage. But this was the era of the Vietnam War. Noor was shipped off in February 1966, and soon after, he was hit in the shoulder by a bullet. After a stint in a field hospital, he returned to the battlefield and was shot again, which resulted in another stay in a field hospital. He avoided death yet again when a few months later, having recovered from his injury, he was crossing a bridge when it was blown up, with shrapnel entering his arms and legs. His injuries were more serious this time, and he was shipped back to the U.S., where he spent many weeks recovering at the Oakland Naval Hospital. Then, on July 9, 1966, he and Teresa issued their wedding vows to each other. By this time, she was already 7 months pregnant. The child, Susan Marlene Noor, was born on September 27, 1966. And unfortunately, just like Sheila, her birth could be considered a curse rather than a miracle. Teresa should have been over the moon. But as you've seen, children more or less got in the way of her doing the things she wanted, which mostly included drinking and meeting new men. Nonetheless, she became pregnant again, and on September 15, 1967, she gave Robert his first son, William Robert Noor. Then, on December 31, 1968, she bore him his second son, Robert Wallace Noor Jr. Now, they were a family with 5 children, a girl and 2 boys from her marriage to Robert, and Howard and Sheila from the husband she'd shot and killed, Clifford. And Teresa was often left to take care of all those kids by herself. After Robert's injuries, he wasn't in any kind of shape for action on the battlefield, but he stayed in the military as a burial escort, when a soldier escorts another fallen soldier to his final resting place. This took Robert all over the world. It was a serious job, and he was proud to have it. But Teresa didn't see it that way. When he was away in a foreign country, she'd see that home. Sure, he was cheating on her. It seems the embers of jealousy she'd once had with Clifford fired up again with Robert. She was absolutely sure he was being unfaithful to her. The jealousy hadn't reared its ugly head with Estelle because of his disability and the fact that he was home all the time taking care of the kids. But with Robert, the paranoid impulses that Teresa had with Clifford came back with a vengeance. But this time, she didn't grab a gun and shoot the man she distrusted. She took her anger out on the kids. She would refuse them food for the slightest transgression, like talking when they were supposed to be quiet, or force them to sit on the floor and not move for an entire day. The slightest transgression would be met with fierce retribution, but these were still the early days of her violence. It would get far, far worse in the future. Thankfully for the kids, Robert was still around, so she never quite reached the brutality she was capable of. But, as happened with Clifford, Robert grew tired of constantly being told he was cheating. In June 1969, he collected his things and left. Not to be outdone, Teresa filed for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty. Robert was flabbergasted. He never so much as laid a finger on her. Nonetheless, the two got back together and promised to give the marriage another go. Despite Robert trying to make things work, Teresa's jealousy continued to be a major factor in their relationship. But about a year after he first left, it was she who filed for divorce. The judge who'd presided over Teresa's murder trial was the same judge who granted the divorce. Teresa was pregnant again at the time, and on June 3, 1970, the 6th and last of her children, Teresa Terry Marie Noor, came into the world. A world that would soon become a living hell. So far, you've seen signs of the evil that Teresa Sr. was capable of, but we haven't even really gotten started yet. Teresa's bitterness was about to turn into something very ugly. Alone, with 6 kids, she was a broken woman. She was angry at the world. She hated men. She hated everything, really. And the only people around her that she could make pay for her pain were her children. Robert made attempts to see them, but Teresa did her best to keep them away from him. He soon married again, and he and Teresa had no contact after that, which infuriated her even more, even though she didn't want him near the kids. In spite of her festering antagonism toward males, she soon found another man. The two wasted no time getting married, Teresa yet again proving she still had her charms. Her new husband was Ronald Pulliam, a railway worker. Like with Estelle, she saw in him a weakness she could exploit. The mistake that she'd made with Robert was choosing a man endowed with too much confidence, someone who wouldn't put up with her tantrums or with her drinking. Ronald would, though. He was a pushover compared to Robert. And after a brief period of happiness, Teresa soon started leaving the kids with him, and she went out to binge drink. She'd come home late, or quite often she wouldn't come home at all. Ronald did at least have the sense to get out of the relationship early. He filed for divorce, stating that Teresa had been unfaithful to him, and once again the same judge presided over the proceedings. Teresa, now 30 years old, spent most of her time after that drinking at the American Legion Hall, and it's there where she met the 59-year-old copy desk editor at the Sacramento Union newspaper, Chet Harris. This time, she really did have a reason to be jealous. As usual, she agreed to a fast-track marriage, but no sooner did they get hitched than she discovered old Chet had a very particular hobby. He liked photographing naked women. He had nudes posted all over his bedroom walls, and he asked her to pose too, but she declined the offer. Teresa wondered what she'd gotten herself into, but it turned out that Chet was really good with the kids. He didn't mind staying home with them. Susan was particularly fond of Chet. Some nights they'd sit in the living room doing jigsaws for hours as he told her stories about monsters from Greek mythology. Teresa had never been a big fan of her kids and had always considered them to be a ball and chain in her life. She didn't mind leaving them with her lovers, but she was now resenting the fact that Susan seemed to like Chet more than she liked her. As was her way, she soon became jealous, but this time it was of her own child's affections. It angered her to see Susan so happy. So on November 22, 1976, just 2 months after the wedding, Teresa filed for divorce. It was the same judge again. He had now presided over 4 of her dissolved marriages as well as her murder case. Luckily for him, he retired soon after, marking the last time that he'd have to deal with Teresa. She'd soon be someone else's problem. So there she was, the mother of 6 children with a string of failed marriages behind her. It was at that point that something changed in Teresa. Her children, the ones who survived her at least, would later say that it seemed like darkness descended on their mother. It was as if she had given up hope. She'd always been a pretty poor mother, but something had snapped inside of her, and now she was about to become an evil mom. Her good looks began to fade. She was rapidly gaining weight and looked much older. She seemed to relinquish any ambitions about reeling in a new man. Gone were the days of spending all of her time at the bar. Instead, she spent most of her time at home, drinking day and night. The children tried best they could to stay out of her way, which was virtually impossible in their small house. Teresa simmered and hissed on the couch like an undetonated bomb. It was only a matter of time until something caused her to blow. Teresa Jr., who often went by Terry, said that her mother became totally unapproachable during this time. She said if she tried to hug her or be nice to her, she would be accused of trying to get something. But if the kids stayed out of their mom's way, she said they were accused of being selfish, unloving children. Terry said all the kids were treated like demon seeds because they were part of the men that Teresa now hated more than anything in the world. The 2 youngest boys, William and Robert, later said that Teresa locked the doors and that the kids were never allowed outside. They weren't even allowed to have friends. She even removed the telephone so no one could contact the outside world. If she was going to be unhappy, everyone was going to be unhappy. Their mom had turned their home into a prison, but it was about to get even worse. The longer Teresa's ill will towards the world festered as she sat drinking on the couch, the more cruel she'd become to her children. To some extent, the kids weren't aware that other children had very different lives, that they were fed properly, played games, and had friends. Robert later said, "I grew up in an insane asylum, basically, but what's worse is we didn't know it was an insane asylum." Terry said on one occasion her mom was drunk and she pulled out her handgun, a .22 caliber pistol. She put it to Terry's head, threatening to kill her. Teresa seemed to enjoy seeing her daughter's intense fear, and for months after, Terry had nightmares about being killed by her mom. But the depravity was still in its nascent stages. Teresa was just getting going. Soon she forced the other children to participate in the punishment of others. She wanted them to feel guilt as well as fear. Food was always scarce, and the kids grew thinner and thinner. One day, Teresa got the kids together and told them that Susan was a witch. Chet Harris, who she now resented with a vengeance, had apparently turned Susan into a witch on one of those nights that they'd stayed up and talked about mythology. Susan likely could not have fully understood the insanity of her mother. She just wanted to be loved, as any child does. As she turned into a teenager and matured into an attractive young woman, Teresa's resentment toward her grew even more. Her own good looks that she'd relied on to manipulate men were now just a memory, and her daughter's beauty now made her irate and envious. At one point, Susan actually managed to escape the home, but she was caught by a truancy officer while she was running through the streets and sent to Sutter Memorial Psychiatric Ward. There, she told the doctors and later a child protection officer what was going on in her household, to her and the other children. The authorities soon turned up at the house, and to their eternal shame, they believed Teresa when she said Susan was lying, that it was all a fantasy. Reluctantly, Susan, now frightened out of her wits, told them her mother was telling the truth. Turning the prey over to the predator, they warned Susan not to run away again. Teresa was going to make Susan pay for what she'd done, and once again she made sure the other children participated directly in the punishment. But Teresa wasn't done. Susan had to suffer even more. To ensure she never ran out of the home again, Teresa bought a pair of handcuffs. At this point, the older kids were no longer attending school. No one in the family even made it past the 8th grade. When they did attend school, they had to be home right after. A school friend of one of the kids later said that if they missed the bus, they became hysterical. Neighbors, of course, saw the children, but rarely did anyone get a glimpse inside the house. Those that did say the place was filthy and stank of urine. When the kids stopped attending school, they stayed home all day, every day, never being allowed out of the house. At night, Teresa handcuffed Susan to the bed. She ordered all the other kids to take turns standing over her, like child soldiers on lookout duty. During the day, she handcuffed Susan in the kitchen. This went on for years. Susan spent so long handcuffed on the floor that she developed sores on her body. Her siblings hated that they were forced to help their mother keep their sister prisoner. But it was better it was happening to someone else than them. And since they had little contact with the outside world, they didn't understand how insane this all was. According to the surviving kids, after that time, Susan was psychologically broken. She stopped eating, she was weak, she would die if this didn't stop. But when she broke, Teresa said she was no longer an escape risk and so finally was allowed to sleep unshackled. The other kids were told they no longer had to keep lookout, so they managed at last to get a full night's rest. This was a huge relief, but it didn't mean Teresa had suddenly realized how cruel she was. And then somehow, in 1982, when Susan was 16, things got even worse. Teresa kept gaining weight, and her once good looks of hers seemed to be transmuting to the faces of her now pretty daughters. Rather than accept this as one of the inevitabilities of the passage of time, or what happens when you drink and smoke and eat junk food all day, she blamed Susan, saying it was the work of one of Susan's spells. Susan said Teresa was up to her old tricks again. She put a hex on her, making her ugly. Handcuffing her to tables wasn't going to change anything. She had to teach Susan a lesson that she wouldn't forget. The children were sitting in the room one day when they heard a gunshot. When they ran to the kitchen, they found Teresa holding a gun. It was the same one that she had once held against Terry's head. Susan lay on the floor, blood issuing from her back. Teresa showed no signs of emotion. She ordered the kids to take Susan to the bathroom and put her in the tub. Calling an ambulance was out of the question, so Teresa stemmed the blood flow herself. She put a bandage over the entry wound, leaving the bullet in Susan's body. For the next few weeks, the children took turns to stand by Susan's bedside, feeding her tidbits of food and giving her water. Unbelievably, Susan eventually regained her strength, the bullet still lodged in her back. The family moved into a new place in North Sacramento in November 1983, which was a trailer in a dismal-looking trailer park on Sacramento's Auburn Boulevard, an area known for drugs, prostitution, and rundown motels. It was the ideal place not to be seen, where strange goings-on usually resulted in people turning the other way. A neighbor in the park would later say that, "I knew they were weird, but I didn't know they were that weird." Another said, "I didn't like that woman." A neighbor who did speak to her would later say, "She had a high, tense voice, and she talked fast, without any commas or periods." Life went on as usual, meaning the occasional argument, but nothing as serious as anyone being shot again. It wasn't until July 1984 that Teresa took her violence to the extreme again. The object of her ire was again Susan. The two got into an argument, and the next thing, Teresa picked up a pair of scissors and stabbed Susan in the back. Susan wasn't grievously injured this time, but she knew if she stayed in that house much longer, there would be an attack that she wouldn't wake up from. She told Teresa she was now 17, a young adult, and it was time she moved out and started a life elsewhere. None of the kids expected Teresa to let her go, but she did. She told Susan she could leave on one condition, only if she were allowed to remove the bullet from Susan's body. Teresa saw this as evidence that could one day come back to haunt her. Given what you've heard so far, it would be easy to say Teresa was clinically insane. But this shows that she wasn't. She knew what she was doing. She was always planning ahead. The home surgery was to take place on the kitchen table, not exactly where you'd call a sterile environment. Teresa's tools to remove the bullet from her back were knives and a scalpel. This was going to be a botched job of the highest order. The biggest risk, of course, was infection. As an anesthetic, this incalculably unloving mom told Susan to take a handful of Malarial capsules, which is an antipsychotic medication, and wash it down with a quart of hard liquor. While this is never advised in a medical setting, it worked, and soon Susan was knocked out. After that, Teresa went to work, although according to some sources, Teresa didn't perform this ad hoc surgery herself, but made her son Robert perform the deed. But whether it was Robert or Teresa who performed the surgery, either way, Susan did not come out of it in good shape. It's believed she likely had a severe infection which turned into sepsis. Sepsis can be deadly, especially when it's not treated in a hospital setting. It's believed that Teresa did give Susan antibiotics, But the next day, Susan's condition got much worse. The kids later said the whites of her eyes became yellow. They didn't know it at the time, but this was jaundice brought on by the sepsis. At that moment, Susan still had a good chance of surviving, but only if she was rushed to a hospital. Teresa wouldn't let that happen. Susan lay in bed, becoming more and more delirious. Terry later said that she noticed black marks all over Susan's back, which would turn out to be severe internal bleeding. In short, Susan was a wreck. This was the result of years of physical and psychological torture. And this time it didn't look like she would survive, so Teresa made the decision not to get her daughter medical help, but to finish her off. Teresa took a roll of duct tape out of a drawer and wrapped it around her daughter's arms and legs before placing another piece over her mouth. Teresa packed all of Susan's clothes and other things into trash bags and then ordered William and Robert to carry Susan out to the car. They all drove south on Highway 89, about 100 miles into the Sierra Nevada, and pulled off when they got to a place called Square Creek Bridge. William and Robert were told to carry their sister down to the riverbank. That they did, and Teresa followed. When they put Susan down, Teresa doused her body in gasoline and lit a match. They walked back to the car, but didn't turn around to see their sister's body in flames. Susan was found the next day, but due to the condition of the body, a positive ID couldn't be made and Susan became a Jane Doe, case number 4873/84. Dr. A.V. Kuna, who conducted Susan's autopsy, said the victim was between 18 and 22 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed about 115 pounds. The body, he said, had suffered extreme abuse, and while the injuries she had sustained were life-threatening, the cause of death was from smoke inhalation. That meant that when Teresa covered her daughter in gas and lit her on fire, Susan had still been alive. Susan, after a lifetime of pain, was finally dead. But Teresa's run of cruelty was by no means over. The boys said there was a strange atmosphere in the house for the following few weeks after Susan was gone. In a normal world, the remaining kids would have been utterly distraught, but this wasn't a normal world. It was a perverted existence engineered by a sad, sadistic woman. Their minds had been so warped over the years that they were too traumatized to escape. Sheila, now 20 years old, didn't really understand how the world worked outside of the house. She'd never been shown love. She lived in continual fear, as all the kids did. So when Teresa told her that she'd have to sell her body to make money for the family, she reluctantly agreed. Sheila knew it was wrong. She absolutely didn't want to do it, but she didn't dare defy her mom. In a twisted way, she soon discovered there were benefits to her new vocation. Teresa, now pocketing thousands of dollars a month, showered Sheila in praise, telling the other children that Sheila's behavior was exemplary. This, said Teresa, is what children are expected to do for their hard-working mothers. The boys looked on with a kind of envy when they saw how much freedom Sheila was now being given. Teresa, being the arch manipulator that she was, had always understood the merits of a divide-and-conquer strategy. She was forever choosing a favorite among her kids, creating ill will amongst them as they all vied for her attention. Alas, Sheila's time in the spotlight of her mother's twisted affection didn't last long. They got into an argument one night after Teresa accused Sheila of being pregnant and not being honest about it. She also said that Sheila had become infected with a venereal disease and that she somehow contracted it too, possibly from the toilet seat. When Sheila screamed back, reminding Teresa of the absolute unfairness of the deal, seeing as she was essentially a slave for her mom, Teresa exploded into one of the worst tantrums the boys had ever seen. She took her paddle and attacked Sheila, after which she hogtied her and shoved her into a closet. Teresa told the boys that the door should not be opened no matter how much Sheila cried, and that she was to be kept in the closet without food or water, despite it being very hot in there. Years later, the youngest daughter, Terry, said she wanted Sheila to confess. That was mother's way. Beat them until they confess. As people subjected to torture often do, Sheila soon confessed to everything and anything she'd been accused of. Teresa then accused her of lying, of making up the details of the confession, and prolonged Sheila's time in the closet, where she was now becoming incredibly weak. After 3 days in the hot closet with no water, Sheila was edging close to death. Terry, who was 13 at the time, later said she heard her sister saying, "Help me, before things went quiet. The boys later testified that on the 3rd day they heard a thumping noise coming from the closet. They didn't know it at the time, but their sister had collapsed. When they finally opened the door, she was lying in the fetal position, dead. Teresa didn't allow them to move her, though. Instead, Sheila's body lay in the closet a few more days until the stench of decomposition was too much to tolerate. The remaining siblings knew what was coming next. Teresa told them to put Sheila's body in a box and carry the box out to the car. They all drove up Interstate 80 in the direction of Truckee Airport in California's Placer County, where they stopped near a field and unloaded Sheila into a patch of weeds. A few hours later, a man named Elmer Barber found what looked like a homemade casket. When he looked inside, he saw a body in a wretched state of decomposition. The Nevada County Sheriff's Department would later make the body a Jane Doe just like her sister, number 660785. The cause of death was noted as undetermined. Teresa had killed 2 of her daughters, but there was still one left, Terry, and she was terrified of what might happen next. Teresa had always been crueler to her girls, and all the children noticed that Teresa was starting to act even more erratically. The house still smelled awful. No amount of cleaning could get rid of the stink of decomposition. Teresa feared the smell would waft out, and sooner or later someone would complain. So she decided to take the most reasonable course of action and burn the place down. On September 26, 1986, she covered parts of the trailer in lighter fluid, and after packing the family's essentials, she ordered Terry to ignite the fluid. But the plan didn't go as expected. As soon as the flames began to spread across the trailer, neighbors noticed and called the fire department, who quickly arrived to put out the fire. Much of the trailer was saved before it could be damaged, including the closet where Sheila had died. So in response to her plan not working out, Teresa ran. She got out of Sacramento, and this time she didn't take her kids with her. They weren't exactly kids at this point anyway. They might still have been under her spell, but Teresa wasn't able or willing to make them go with her. Howard, who was at this point 26, split from the family. William, who was 24, had enough freedom to meet a girl, and he went to stay with her. Terry, the last remaining girl, only 16, managed to get away with using Sheila's ID, so she passed as 21. Only Robert, 19, stayed with Teresa, and they both moved to Las Vegas. None of them breathed a word about their murdered siblings, though. They were still so traumatized they kept the years of torture secret, and Teresa might well have gotten away with the murders had Robert not broken the law on November 7, 1991. Short on cash, he walked into Red's Bar on North Nellis Boulevard in Las Vegas and, waving a gun in the air, tried to rob the place. Exactly what happened next is not clear, but an altercation of some kind took place, and the bartender, Robert Ward, was shot. After Robert was convicted and given 16 years, Teresa knew better than to hang around, and so she moved to Salt Lake City. There, she moved in with an 85-year-old woman, acting as the woman's caretaker. It just so happened that Terry was also then living in Salt Lake City. She'd gotten married and was working in a grocery store. She would have been horrified had she known her mother was living nearby. Terry was the only one of the children who tried to report what had happened in that house. In 1989, she'd gone to the police and told them about the horrors she and her siblings had faced. The story seemed outrageous, though, and the police didn't believe her. Even a therapist she went to for help said she was making it up. After that, Terry gave up on trying to find justice. But then on October 28, 1993, she got the confidence to give it another shot. After watching TV, she phoned the hotline for the television show America's Most Wanted. Though the cases shown weren't related to her, it still inspired her to approach the police one last time. From there, Terry was told to contact detectives in California, where Susan's body had been dumped, and this time the police listened to her. Police Sergeant Ron Perea of the Nevada County, California Sheriff Office met with her, and she told him the full, lurid tale. Given how unbelievable it sounded, he was hesitant at first, but he checked out her story and was able to corroborate it with evidence. Finally, police were able to connect the 2 Jane Does to the sisters Terry was talking about. The Los Angeles Times was soon reporting that the police had begun unraveling a tale of domestic violence so depraved that even they were shocked. The public was incensed, especially as Terry had tried to come forward before and been told she was making it up. In a separate news report, it was said the only thing we can surmise is that the people she reported it to thought her story was so bizarre it couldn't be truthful. At the start of November 1993, investigators filed felony complaints against Teresa. The 2 brothers, William and Robert, who'd helped her dispose of the bodies, were also charged. William was in Sacramento working at a warehouse, while Robert was serving time for the Vegas robbery in the Nevada County Jail. Once in custody, both men were first reluctant to talk about their deceased sisters or anything that had happened in that house of horror, but both eventually confessed to playing a part in their mother's gruesome crimes. 5 days later, investigators in Salt Lake City told the California detectives that they knew Teresa was likely in their city due to her applying for a driver's license and the fact that just a few days before, she'd been arrested for a DUI. Sergeant John Fitzgerald of the Placer County Sheriff's Office flew out to Salt Lake to the house listed on Teresa's driving application form. He waited until night fell and knocked on her front door, after which she answered and was immediately placed in handcuffs. Their timing was impeccable, since Teresa was in the middle of packing up her belongings to move to another city. Teresa refused to talk to detectives, only telling them she wanted a lawyer. The charges against her included torture and murder. After being arraigned in Salt Lake, she was extradited to Placer County, where she was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, multiple murder, and murder by torture, which meant she was facing a possible death sentence. After pleading not guilty, she was sent to Sacramento County Jail. Superior Court Judge J. Richard Cousins, who'd read out the charges, also ordered that William be tried as an adult. Robert agreed to testify against his mom in exchange for a less harsh sentence. The next month, all the charges against him were dropped. Teresa, who was then informed about Robert turning against her, decided she wasn't going to win and changed her plea to guilty in order to avoid the death penalty. In 1995, Judge William R. Ridgway sentenced Teresa to 2 life sentences, saying her crimes showed callousness beyond belief. While the boys did help get rid of the bodies, there was no doubt that their life of brutal torture made them victims too. Robert, who was serving time for robbery, was handed 3 years to be served concurrently with his robbery sentence, and William was put under probation in order to undergo therapy. Both men would require a lot of therapy, as would Teresa Jr. Sadly, Terry died of a heart attack in 2011 at the age of 42, but not before appearing on various TV programs in an attempt to explain what happened to her and her siblings in that house. "What kind of mother would do that?" she once said during an interview. "What kind of person am I going to be for the rest of my life because of this? Believe me," she said, "I've asked myself 1,000 times why I didn't take my sisters and run." All the kids said the same thing. They'd been so scared, so brainwashed, they didn't have the ability to run. Teresa is still alive and serving her sentence. She'll be eligible for parole in 2027, though given the horrific nature of her crimes, it's likely she'll never walk the streets as a free woman again.
Just about all of us, at some point in time, will have been on the end of a punishment from those people we call parents. For the younger of our viewers, that might have been having your iPad or phone taken away from you until your homework was finished. For others, punishments will likely have taken the form of less money coming your way, a short period of time you were not allowed to go and hang out with your buddies, or even a little smack to the behind when you were very young. But not all moms and dads read the various good parenting manuals that come out for every generation, and you could say some parents take punishments a bit too far. That's exactly what we'll look at today, in this episode of the Infographic Show, Worst Punishments Kids Received from Their Parents. We'll offer a disclaimer first and say that some punishments might have been common in the past, hence sayings such as spare the rod and spoil the child. This phrase relates to corporal punishment, like spanking, hitting with a rod, shoe, stick, or cane. This kind of thing seems outdated now, but some people still argue that it is needed. So when we say worst, that's subjective. According to Psychology Today, such punishments are still common throughout the world. We will talk about more common punishments in this show, or perhaps punishments that could be conceived as common, rather than scour the media for instances in which sadistic parents did horrible things to their children. We'll try and keep it light, and at the end you can decide what punishment was the worst. Number 10. Not sparing the rod. Domestic corporal punishment is largely frowned upon and has actually been outlawed in many countries, but many nations have not imposed a ban. It's a punishment that is supposed to inflict pain on the child, such as spanking, sometimes known as smacking, or hitting the child with an object, such as dad's smelly size 12 slipper. In fact, looking at forums which had input from kids growing up in the mid to late 20th century, getting hit with a hand or an object wasn't out of the ordinary. People wrote that their parents would not use their hands, but use a paddle, a cane, a shoe, or perhaps worse, a belt. We put this in the number 10 spot not because we don't think it's bad, but because in the past it was so normalized. Things have changed though. Number 9. Washing the mouth out with soap and water. While it's hard to believe that this was a thing, there are many recorded cases of it happening that have been discussed in studies. Usually the child will have spoken out of turn, perhaps cursed, even blasphemed, and the resultant punishment for such an infraction would be to literally wash the child's mouth out with soap and water. Believe it or not, we found a website called Meanestmom.com where a woman talks about how this had proved successful in disciplining her son. In the comments section, other moms said vinegar works just as well. This was 2009, but reading such comments, one might think there was internet in 1909. Number 8. Grounded. Now you've all probably been grounded, but sometimes that could be more like imprisonment and you might wish you'd have been made to swallow some soapy water. We found online that some parents have used a punishment called long-term grounding, or what sounds more like house arrest. One person on Reddit said he'd spent much of his teenage years grounded. On another blog, we found a kid who had been grounded for 8 months. There is a saying, grounded for life, but such a punishment would no doubt be very abnormal. Nonetheless, some parents believe that by keeping their kids close, they are protecting them. Most psychologists believe the opposite, and that such mollycoddling will make the child weaker and unable in later life to deal with social problems. Number 7. Shooting up your stuff. As you know, parents often take your things away from you as a punishment, which is a kind of deprivation. Some parents have taken this a step further. One such person appeared in American news media in 2012 after he shot up his 15-year-old's laptop and posted the video on YouTube. He later got a visit from Child Protection Services. We might also add that even though the video went viral, some people said it was fake and the dad was just trying to get some publicity. All we can say is taking a gun to your kids' digital devices, if real, is kinda harsh. Number 6. The end of privacy as you know it. Looking around the web, there are forums with parents asking if it's okay for them to remove their teenager's bedroom door. Some parents ask if it's even legal, as teens might have a legal right to their privacy. One person said on a forum, "Their right to privacy does not supersede my need to make sure they're not engaging in activities that could be detrimental to their future." Others called it cruel. What we found is that plenty of parents do it, in spite of the time it must take. On one forum, a person wrote that if you stop them from doing something in their bedroom, they will more than likely just do it somewhere else. Perhaps it's best to talk to kids about the actual thing. Number 5. Public humiliation. In 2012, the Huffington Post published a blog post in which one writer said public humiliation of kids is a new trend, at least in the USA. She cited an instance in which parents in Illinois made their 8-year-old daughter stand outside school, wrapped in a sandwich board that read, "I like to steal from others," and lie about it. Another kid in Miami had to stand outside his school, holding a sign that said, "I was sent to school to get an education, not to be a bully." And yet another kid in Denver had to stand on a public street, holding a sign that read, "I am a thief, I took money from a family member." Since it became quite common, some people have called it barbaric and abusive. Perhaps one of the most brutal of public humiliations was the parent that shaved her 12-year-old daughter's head and made her run up and down the street in a diaper. The parents did this in 2012 because the girl had gotten bad grades. The mother and her boyfriend were later charged with a gross misdemeanor. Number 4. Viral shaming. This is quite similar to public humiliation, but it goes a step further in that you won't just be shamed for a day, but people can enjoy laughing at you for many years after the actual event. Time magazine wrote about public shaming via the internet in 2015, stating parents chastise and embarrass their kids with the intent to post the video on YouTube. Sometimes kids holding up signs similar to what we talked about were later posted online by the parents. One video shows a teen holding a sign saying, "I'm a liar and a thief. When I grow up, I want to go to prison. I am on the road to failure. I am a self-entitled teenager." Time interviewed a psychologist who, not surprisingly, was very much against such shaming, saying the internet is forever. These videos could have an effect on a child's whole life, maybe cost them a job someday. His advice? Parents, wise up and leave those kids alone. Number 3. Hacking your child. In 2010, a news report emerged in which a 16-year-old boy was suing his mom for hacking his email and social media accounts and then saying things that upset him. The mother said this was just punishment because her son had said some things on social media that she didn't like. In 2012, another mom in Ohio hacked her daughter's Facebook page, leaving a post stating, "I do not know how to keep my mouth shut. I am no longer allowed on Facebook or my phone. Please ask why. My mom says I have to answer everyone that asks." There's an ongoing debate about how ethical this child hacking is. At what age should the kids have total control over their accounts? Number 2. Tying your kids up. Some parents have been so lost regarding how to keep their kids out of trouble that they have resorted to not allowing the children to go anywhere. As we said at the start, we don't want to focus too much on the criminal and abusive aspects of punishment, but these stories made the news of late as over-the-top kinds of punishments. One was a kid in China who was seen with a steel chain around his neck in his bedroom. The Chinese dad told the press in 2014 that his son just kept stealing from neighbors, and because it was a small community, the son would get caught. The dad would then have to return the goods, or if they were gone, he'd have to pay. "I can't keep paying compensation all the time because I just can't afford it, and eventually someone was going to call the police and he would have been locked up," said the dad. Another case was in Malaysia in 2016, when a mother tied her 11-year-old daughter to a lamppost with a steel chain because the girl had been skipping school. "There is such a thing as tough love, but this is taking it too far," said one person who had seen the stricken girl. And finally, number 1. Taking the poop to school. In 2002, the LA Times wrote that two parents were facing charges for abusing their child, a young teen that had been an example of very tough love. One day, his parents had forced him to take dog feces to school with him in his school bag because he had failed to clean up the yard. The mother was charged with misdemeanor child abuse and the father was acquitted. The case was well known at the time. The 16-year-old had indeed been a problem child, but people couldn't decide if such a punishment should be a crime. Concussions are clear and diagnosable.
Everyone knows that kid. You know, the one who's always sporting the nicest clothes and had all the coolest toys, but would never let other kids play with them. The one who threw the most outrageous birthday parties that everyone desperately hoped to be invited to, and the one who would yell and scream at their parents and throw an absolute fit if they didn't get their way. We've all had a run-in with the spoiled kid. But the most spoiled kids in the world take things to a whole other level. Many celebrities claim that they're raising their children to be normal, down-to-earth kids. But when you're born into a life of wealth, privilege, and fame, is it even possible not to be spoiled? Monroe and Moroccan Cannon, the 9-year-old twin children of Mariah Carey and her ex-husband Nick Cannon, may be kept out of the limelight for the most part, but being the children of celebrities definitely comes with some perks. The twins have already had the opportunity to travel the world while their mom is on tour, and they even get to spend every Christmas in the luxury resort town of Aspen, Colorado. And speaking of Christmas, these lucky kiddos got to star in the music video for their mom Mariah's hit song All I Want for Christmas Is You. And that's not their only claim to fame. They've been credited as collaborators on mom's albums and even performed on stage with her. If that's not enough, superstar mom Mariah rented out the entire park at Disneyland to throw the twins an elaborate and exclusive 6th birthday party. But best of all is the fact that the twins have their very own candy store at home, fully stocked with every treat imaginable. If you're gonna spoil your kids, that seems like a pretty good way to do it. Not all celebrity parents are so keen to keep their kids out of the limelight. Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes' daughter has been used to the spotlight and the attention that comes from having famous parents for as long as she can remember, and it shows. Suri Cruise, the 14-year-old daughter of famous actors Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes, seemed like she was on a straight path to the spoiled life from day one. Suri was the apple of her parents' eye, and no expense was spared when it came to making her happy. For her 6th birthday, the toddler was reportedly gifted a $24,000 playhouse, complete with electricity and running water, and decorated by an interior designer. As a toddler, Suri was spotted wearing name-brand high-heeled shoes at the age of 3, and as a child, her wardrobe was reportedly worth more than $3 million. $150,000 of that was in shoes alone. Thankfully, in recent years, since her parents' high-profile and contentious divorce, the preteen seems to be more down-to-earth, having been spotted wearing casual jeans and t-shirts, and is expected to help out with chores around the house, including making her own bed every day. Suri's path from spoiled toddler to true diva may have taken a turn for the better, but that's definitely not the case for most spoiled celebrity spawn. North West, the 7-year-old daughter of uber-famous parents Kanye West and Kim Kardashian, shows no signs of slowing down on her path to becoming a full-fledged diva. Her wardrobe alone is said to have been worth more than $1 million before she was even 2 years old. It's enough to make any adult turn green with envy. Sources close to the family claim that Little North never wears the same thing twice, and she's been spotted in custom outfits by big-name designers like Alexandra Wang and Stella McCartney. She was even photographed wearing a pair of $50,000 diamond earrings, and she sparked controversy when she was seen at one of her dad's fashion shows wearing a custom and possible genuine fur coat worth thousands of dollars. Her parents also caught flack for letting their young daughter have her naturally curly hair chemically straightened. Mom Kim insists that these expensive salon treatments are a special twice-yearly treat for the girl. And it's not just her wardrobe that makes her spoiled. North is already displaying some decidedly diva-like behavior, as evidenced when she attended a friend's birthday party and she stole the spotlight by taking it upon herself to blow out the candles on the birthday cake before the birthday girl even had a chance to do it herself. Since insiders claim that Kanye and Kim are addicted to spoiling their little girl, we can expect more outlandish stories about how spoiled North West is as she grows up. Power couple Jay-Z and Beyoncé don't do anything on a small scale, and that's certainly true when it comes to their 8-year-old daughter, Blue Ivy Carter. Before she was even born, Jay-Z reportedly said, "At the end of the day, I know I'll probably have the worst spoiled little kid ever, and Blue Ivy is doing her best to live up to his words. She's had a front row seat to the Grammy Awards every year since 2015, and she even made headlines when she shushed her very famous parents while they were chatting during a presentation at the 2018 awards. She has her very own staff, including 2 full-time nannies, a team of bodyguards, a personal chef, and even her very own personal stylist. As for toys, Blue Ivy has everything a little girl could ever dream of, including custom diamond-encrusted Barbie dolls, and of course, her own pony. But perhaps the biggest clue that this little girl is beyond spoiled? Despite her dad being a born and bred New Yorker for life, the family uprooted their lives and moved halfway across the country just so that little Blue Ivy could attend the very best and most exclusive private school, the Center for Early Education in Los Angeles, California, where tuition costs more than $25,000 a year. This spoiled princess doesn't show any signs of slowing down either. Her name is apparently already being trademarked, and rumor has it she's planning to launch her own fragrance line in the near future. How's that for hustle? Blue Ivy and Northwest may still be young, but if their parents want to see what a lifetime of being spoiled could lead to, they only need to look at Willow and Jaden Smith for a glimpse at what the teen years could bring. Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith's 2 children, son Jaden, 22, and daughter Willow, age 20, are the epitome of entitled celebrity spawn. Sure, both kids have lavish taste in clothing. At 15, Willow was spotted carrying a $5,000 Louis Vuitton purse. But what really makes them so spoiled is their incredibly entitled and tone-deaf attitudes. Their parents have been open about their very lenient, hands-off parenting style. But in 2017, Will Smith admitted that we may have gone too far. The Smith kids grew up with complete freedom to go where they want, do what they want, and say whatever they want. And their parents encouraged complete freedom of expression in their kids from a young age. Turns out this might have turned them into raging narcissists. Jaden has expressed that he has a goal to be just the most craziest person of all time. We're sure that makes mom and dad so proud. In 2017, Jaden threw a fit and took to Twitter to blast a Toronto hotel for trying to poison him by spiking his pancake with cheese. Turns out the teen simply didn't realize that one of the main ingredients in the hotel's signature ricotta pancakes was ricotta cheese. Jaden and his sister Willow seem to view themselves as some kind of visionaries, with Jaden saying, "We don't think a lot of the music out there is cool, so we make our own music." Which would be fine if all this freedom of expression was being channeled into a productive and creative career, but instead the pair seem content to spend their days modeling couture fashion and complaining about everything, from school to pancakes on social media. Will and Jada aren't the only celebrity parents struggling to keep their kids grounded. Former soccer star David Beckham and his wife Victoria, aka Posh Spice, are facing their own struggles when it comes to raising celebrity kids with a solid work ethic. When David Beckham was named GQ's Man of the Year in 2019, he took to the media to brag about how he and Victoria were raising their children to understand the value of hard work. But it doesn't appear that the lesson is sinking in. According to sources close to the couple, who have 4 children together, their children's work ethic, or lack thereof, is a major point of disagreement between the pair. David thinks the kids should learn to fend for themselves and work their way up in the world the same way he did, through hard work and talent. But Victoria disagrees. The Beckhams can afford to give their kids anything they could ever want, and she doesn't see why they shouldn't spoil them. With the parents so divided over the issue, is it any wonder that the Beckham kids seem to be some of the most spoiled celebrity spawn in the world? 21-year-old son Brooklyn dropped out of university, and although he's apparently now doing an internship with a famous photographer, it doesn't seem like he's taking it too seriously. He's been spotted on lavish vacations with his family many times while he's supposed to be working, and is frequently seen out until the wee hours of the morning partying with his famous friends, like Gordon Ramsay's son Jack. 18-year-old son Romeo apparently dreams of taking after his star athlete father and wants to be a pro tennis player, but despite his parents arranging private court time with tennis pros like Andy Murray, he's yet to turn his hobby into a pro career, something most tennis pros have done by their teen years. 15-year-old son Cruz wants to follow in his mother's footsteps and has apparently been signed by Justin Bieber's manager for years. But despite his parents continually bragging about him being in the studio, he's yet to release any music. Perhaps there is hope that their youngest child, 9-year-old daughter Harper, will grow up with a better work ethic than her brothers, but we won't hold our breath. No list of the most spoiled kids in the world would be complete without mentioning Prince George. the 7-year-old son of Prince William and Kate Middleton, and the future King of England. After his 3rd birthday party, his father, Prince William, admitted that he got too many things, he's far too spoiled. Those comments aside, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have taken great pains to give their children a normal childhood. Well, as normal as possible for royals, that is. Apparently, young George doesn't even know he'll be king one day. For now, he's just a normal 7-year-old who goes to school and spends time playing with his parents and siblings. But you can only be so normal when your grandmother is the Queen of England, and young George enjoys many luxuries that other little boys could only dream of. On top of a robust family staff, which includes full-time nannies, cooks, and stylists, young George enjoys spending his summers at the family's favorite getaway, Balmoral Castle in Scotland. He also splits his time between the family's luxurious apartments at Kensington Palace and their summer home, the 18th century manor, Anmer Hall. The 10-bedroom, 3-floor estate was extensively renovated after his birth to the tune of $2 million. And even if his parents try not to spoil him with gifts, they can't stop his loving and loyal subjects from lavishing the future king with spectacular presents, including a nail clipper set made of 18-karat gold and encrusted with 350 diamonds, reportedly valued at nearly $1.5 million. Prince George may be a down-to-earth little boy for now, but there's no doubt that he's spoiled. After all, one day he will inherit an entire empire. Everyone may have their own stories about their run-in with a spoiled kid, but we can thank our lucky stars that we don't have to deal with the most spoiled kids in the world. Prepubescent psychopaths commit the vilest evil against an infant. Today, they walk free among you. A tyrannical teen becomes a serial killer of taxi drivers and disco dancers. These are just a couple of cases in our gruesome catalog of killer kids, the young monstrosities you won't believe are real. Zachary Davis. We'll start with the boy that we call the ultimate face of evil, a young man who perfectly fits the description of disturbed. The date is August 10th, 2012. A 15-year-old boy in Tennessee, USA is going about his normal day. He's a quiet kid. He doesn't have too many friends. Those that do know him think he's a bit strange. He's obsessed with serial killers for some reason. He loves reading about their methods. One of his pastimes is Googling types of torture. He often downloads images of obscene gore. His favorite book? Stephen King's Misery. You could say he's one to keep an eye on. Not long ago, he wrote in his notebook, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter." This is a kid who is loved by his mother Melanie, a paralegal and a triathlete who adores Zachary and his 16-year-old brother Josh. On this day, all three of them go to see a movie. It's been a good day out. Melanie knows both boys have not been right since their father died in 2007 of ALS. She sent Zachary to see a psychiatrist. While the psychiatrist did say her son was suffering from a depressive disorder, Melanie decided it was best to cure her son with love and understanding. It was a mistake, a grave one. After they got home from the movie, Zachary goes into his room and starts packing things into a backpack. The items include his beloved notebooks and a toothbrush, but what's entirely disturbing is he also packs a pair of gloves, a ski mask, and a claw hammer. He has plans for the future, but right now he's concentrated on the present, which means waiting for Melanie to go to bed. She does that at about 9 p.m., and when Zachary can hear the sounds of her slumber, he calmly walks into her room with a sledgehammer held in his hands. Towering above Melanie, he strikes her head with significant force. He keeps striking maybe 20 times until his mother is well and truly smashed, like someone on a medieval wheel. Blood is everywhere, spattered all over the bed and on the wall, covering Zachary himself. He looks like a maniac, clenching the weapon in his now red hands. He walks to what he calls the game room and takes whiskey and gasoline to drench the place. Soon the room is aflame, and Zachary, purposefully leaving his sleeping brother alone, leaves the house hoping his brother will die in the fire. Thanks to a fire alarm and the fact that Zachary had closed the game room door, his brother will survive. Zachary's plans are thwarted when he's picked up by police about 10 miles away from his house. During a subsequent interrogation in what can be described as a voice that epitomizes evil, he explains some things. The detective already knows some things about Zachary, his obsession with killing, his mental distress, and what seems like a willingness to emulate his favorite serial killers. Zachary explains what his plans were, what would have happened had he not been picked up by the cops. "I didn't feel anything when I killed her," Zachary said about his mother. Something was obviously very wrong with this kid. He had some serious mental issues. His father's death had obviously hurt him, but he had a loving family, unlike the majority of the serial killers he admired, whose lives were mired in trauma from a young age. Zachary's evil seemed to come from an unknown place. He was an enigma, like all the kids you'll hear about today. Even in court, he showed absolutely no remorse when he was shown photographs of his mother's beaten body. He quite calmly explained that he'd used the sledgehammer because there was no chance of missing or leaving her alive. He smiled when describing the sound the weapon made when connecting with her head. It was a wet, thumping sound, he recalled. In later interviews, he looked like a madman. When the judge sentenced Zachary to life in prison, he shared some words with the court. "You became evil, Mr. Davis. You went to the dark side. It's that plain and simple. Can we beat this story? You know us, viewers. Of course we can." Let's now have a look at one of the murders that Zachary had read about and was highly impressed with, a crime that he admitted served as an inspiration for his own crime. Nevada Tan. What's so utterly shocking about this next crime is that the murderer was only 11 years old, and to most people she seemed like a little girl who was as harmless as the teddy bears she kept by her bed. She was in fact a brutal killer of the highest order, and that's why young Zachary had so much respect for her. On June 1st, 2004, Girl A is at her elementary school in Sasebo in Japan's Nagasaki Prefecture. It's lunchtime, and Girl A walks up to another girl, 12-year-old Satomi Mitarai. It's just an ordinary lunch break for all the other 6th graders, some of whom are playing, others napping, but most are still eating from their bento boxes. Girl A goes on over to Satomi's desk and says to her, "Hey, come outside with me. I have something funny to show you." Satomi has never really had any issues with Girl A, so why not go see this thing? The two walk out of the classroom, and Girl A leads the way to another room, an empty one. Satomi asks her what this funny thing is. Girl A's face suddenly transforms into an expression of infantile rage. She whips out an incredibly sharp box cutter and slices Satomi's neck. Soon after the teacher realizes the girls are missing, she goes to see where they are when she finds young Satomi lying in a pool of blood. When she asks Girl A what happened, she hears the reply, "I have done a bad thing." There has never been a clear motive. Maybe Girl A had read too many violent comic books. Maybe she was stressed or had Asperger's syndrome, but she wasn't the only case of kids killing other kids in Japan. Satomi's father later said, "I can't understand it at all. I don't have a clue." Sometimes the reasons for such acts are not easy to ascertain, especially when the killer is so young and seemingly innocent. Girl A apparently cried a lot after the murder. She was sent to a kind of special school for rehabilitation. Strangers even wished her well. Others did not. They knew about the stories of Girl A kicking and punching other students. They knew that she was very capable of violence. They'd heard the police psychologist who said Girl A scared the hell out of her classmates and that there had been an incident with her and a knife not long before the murder. They also knew about her obsession, which was looking at violent images online. She loved the Battle Royale story and was a big fan of the death-themed Flash animation urban legend Red Room. You can, of course, hope that she'll get better and one day become a functioning member of society. It might be possible, but with this next sicko, we seriously doubt that's ever going to happen. That's because this young chap didn't just kill one person, he became the USA's youngest ever serial killer. Craig Price. When this young man was arrested at the age of 16, like many of the kids we'll talk about today, he was as cool as ice. He had that look of a psychopath, which featured the iconic complete lack of remorse. It's July 27, 1987. Craig is just 13 years old. He's already gotten into petty crime, stealing, breaking into houses, and even a bit of stalking. But tonight, he's about to up the ante. He has a plan, and that is to break into his neighbor's house in Warwick, Rhode Island. The owner is 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer. She might have seen Craig around the neighborhood, but the two don't know each other. Craig crawls through her window, walks into the kitchen and grabs a knife, after which he goes into her bedroom where she's sleeping and stabs her 58 times. This is a boy whose friends like to watch Scooby-Doo and still play with action figures. Despite some bad behavior, Craig is liked in the neighborhood. He's a large kid, but with a baby face. He's good at football, given his bulk, and soon gets the name Iron Man, even though he's still just a kid. No one suspects that he is a vicious killer. Like all serial killers, once he's had a taste for blood, he needed more. It's 2 years later when his neighborhood becomes frozen with shock when Craig's own family starts talking about a monster in their midst. Someone who's done the most terrible thing. Craig takes pleasure in the fact that they have no idea they are talking about him. By all accounts, Craig lives in a stable family, and he is loved and cared for. His home life, at least to friends of the family, is great. The other night, he broke into the house of 39-year-old Joan Heaton. He had one intention as he sneaked into her house with the butcher's knife he'd bought earlier. This 15-year-old savage stabs her as she sleeps. She screams out as he bites her face. He loves the sound she makes when she's hurt. After stabbing her 62 times, he walks into the bedroom of her kids, both now awake and shaking with fright. The girls Jennifer, 10, and Melissa, 8, are later found in a similar state to their mom. For the detectives that arrive on the scene, it's a sight they never thought possible. They're traumatized by what they see. Soon the newspapers are talking about the Warwick slasher. People put extra locks on their doors. They never leave the windows open. They order their children home long before nighttime sets in. They are literally terrorized by a boy who they often chat with. Someone they think is a little bit cheeky at times, but a good kid on the whole. The police know something they don't. They're looking for a killer with huge feet. Size 13, which is not a common size at all. Believing these crimes are the work of someone local, they put their heads together and find a kid who's been done for burglary before and other minor crimes. That's Craig Price, and when they look in his backyard shed, they find a collection of knives. They bring him in, and one of the first things they ask is, "Where did you get that big gash on your finger?" Craig didn't deny it for long. In fact, he seemed almost proud of his work. The newspapers were soon talking about the capture of Rhode Island's most notorious serial killer. But what people started talking about was the fact that this 5-foot, 10-inch, 240-pound kid was 15 and he'd started killing when he was 13. How on earth was that possible? It was unheard of even in ultra-violent America, a country where serial killers were seemingly propagating like tadpoles in a large swamp. Craig didn't seem one bit bothered about his crimes when he described them to the detectives. When he talked about killing those children, it was like he was explaining what he had for lunch that day. One of the detectives later said, "He talked about killing these people like it was nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. It's incredible." And he took pleasure in telling them that because he was a juvenile, he'd soon be out of prison. To say the least, the detectives who'd seen the bite marks on the mother's face and witnessed knife blades snapped off in the arms of her young daughters were furious. All they thought was, this is a person that has no remorse, and we believe when he says that he will make history when he gets out in a few years. Craig actually told them he would, bragging about it. That night, Detective Tom Colgan returned home to his wife and children and bawled his eyes out. He cried and cried and cried. He'd been the first person on the scene in that triple murder, and to see this kid smirk at his actions broke him. Detective Kevin Collins reacted differently. He flew into a rage, promising himself that as long as he lived, that kid was not going to walk out of juvenile detention in a few years' time. With relatives of the victims and local police, Collins created the Citizens Opposed to the Release of Craig Price group. The pressure mounted and the state soon passed a law that allowed juveniles to be tried in adult court, but only for serious crimes. This is why Craig is still in prison today and may never be released. Since his arrest, he's seen many psychiatrists. As we said, it seemed that Craig Price came from a loving family. There's no evidence of any abuse, not even aggressive spanking. He said in the past that white people were to blame because when he was young, on occasion people issued racist slurs at him. That might have been true, and as wrong as it is, people generally don't mutilate children when they're offended. Psychiatrists have said that Craig is a psychopath. His violence has nothing to do with racism, and one of them said, "I suspect from all I've seen and know of these murders that Craig was in a psychotic rage at the time of these events and that he should probably be classified as a serial murderer, a disorganized type." The Heaton family he killed had only lived in that neighborhood for 2 weeks. They'd even helped Craig fix his bike chain one day. Craig later said he felt a racist aura around the mom. He later admitted, "I knew the act of killing Joan Heaton was the answer." Now a grown man, Craig has had multiple fights in prison and on occasion has attacked other inmates with shivs. He did that just in 2019 and was sentenced to 25 years for it. While inmates who kill kids and women can face harassment and kill-on-sight type violence from other inmates, his history of incarceration shows that he's the one who initiated most of the attacks against the inmates and officers. Can some people be born evil? Can the brain just be wired up the wrong way with some folks? We'll tell you our theory soon, but first you need to hear about another blossoming beast, Jasmine Richardson. If there ever was a natural-born killer, Craig Price was one, and we have no doubt that Jasmine Richardson could also be given this title. Like Craig, she had a few screws loose. As we said before, with just about all serial killers, there's a history of extreme childhood trauma and horrific violence. But with some killers, it's never obvious where they got their evil side from. Jasmine is one of those people. The story contains 2 killers, but one of them was 23 at the time they met in 2016. He was the lover of Jasmine, Jeremy Steinke. She was 13 at the time of the murders, but 12 when she met him. Sure, you can say he made her do it. She's also a victim, but we're not buying that. The story takes place in Medicine Hat, a city in southeast Alberta, Canada, population 63,000. They met at a punk rock concert. Jasmine is really taken with this older guy, who most people think is way too old for her. He's an unusual guy too, claiming he's a 300-year-old werewolf. He's an angry goth, a rebel without a cause. More Marilyn Manson than Susie and the Banshees. Jasmine's parents don't want their daughter seeing a guy who's so much older than her. She's a child and he's a young adult. They don't actually know he's a bit messed up. His mom is a very angry alcoholic and his stepfather has been abusive to him. Jasmine's parents, who love her dearly, try to stop the relationship in its tracks, and Jeremy becomes enraged. He writes online, "Their throats I want to slit. They will regret the beep they have done, especially when I see to it that they are gone. Their blood shall be payment." Thing is, this is the kind of thing he always writes. He does claim to be a werewolf after all. People took him about as seriously as they would a child throwing a tantrum because Santa didn't bring him a helicopter for Christmas. Nonetheless, bad plus bad doesn't equal good. There is someone else in this equation who looks at his words online and says, "Okay, good idea, let's do it." About 1 month later, Deborah Richardson and her husband Mark are stabbed to death in their basement at home. Just after Jeremy had done this to them, he goes upstairs to where Jasmine's little brother Jacob is pleading for his life. As he whines at them, "I'm too young to die," Jasmine starts feverishly stabbing him. Jeremy then finishes him off by slashing his throat. As planned, the two go on the run with some help from a third party. Right now, it seems like the young girl might have been taken advantage of by a very troubled man. But is this the case? Is Jasmine also a victim? We think not. Not only did she stab her brother, but she had made the plan with her lover, whom she promised to marry. In fact, it seems killing her parents was her idea. Police records show the first time anyone talked about killing anyone was in an email when Jasmine wrote to Jeremy saying, "It begins with me killing them and ends with me living with you." She received the reply, "Well, I love your plan, but we need to get a little more creative with details and stuff." Later, Jeremy said, "When you find your soulmate, you'll do anything for them. I did anything." Jasmine also shared some words in court of a similar nature, saying about her plan, "I loved him so much I thought it would bring us closer together." Jasmine was charged with first-degree murder, as was her lover. She spent some time in a young offenders unit and later in a psychiatric unit. To some people's dismay, she was released back into the world in 2016. Jeremy Steike is still serving a 25-year sentence. This next story will make you wonder what it means to be a human. Even though it happened years ago, the wound it left on Great Britain is still oozing with anger and tears. The question you have to answer is, just how evil can you be when you're just a kid? We mean barely past the age where you don't like to sleep without a light glimmering in your bedroom. Robert Thompson and John Venables. It's February 12, 1993. Two kids, Robert Thompson and John Venables, both just 10 years of age, are in a shopping center not far from the city of Liverpool in England. Like they so often do, they're skipping school. They hate school and find much more pleasure in going to the local shops and stealing candy and toys. On this day, they've stolen a bunch of things, including some modeling paint they'll later use in the vilest way you can imagine. This is what happens next. They're looking at people in the shopping center, many of them mothers with children too young for school. What they're actually doing is looking for a victim. They're like jaguars assessing their prey. They intend to steal a child away from their mother and take them to a quiet place in the street where they will throw them in front of a car. That would be evil in itself, but they're going to do much, much worse. They find their prey, a 2-year-old named Jamie Bolger. He's with his mother, Denise. Just for a second, she lets go of Jamie's hand because she needs to pay for the meat she just bought at the butcher shop. When she turns around to see where Jamie is, he's gone. CCTV is right now showing Jamie being led away by 2 young boys, images that will soon be seared into the minds of the British public. The boys take Jamie to a canal not too far away from the shopping center. That's where they begin their torment by dropping the small child on his head. They keep walking and are seen in total by about 38 people. Some adults naturally ask what 2 kids are doing with an infant, to which the reply is that he's their younger brother. They giggle as they walk along, even going into a pet shop for a while. It's all good fun for them. When they get to a secluded bit of railway line somewhere in the distance, they begin their sadistic torture, which includes using that modeling paint. They do things to him with batteries, bricks, and stones, hurting him as an angry child might do to an old doll. They finally kill Jamie with a heavy weight taken from the train tracks. Doctors will later say the child suffered 42 serious injuries, any of which could have killed him. Jamie is already dead by the time they place him on the railway tracks. When both boys are talking about how cool it will look when a train goes over him, and then they get bored with waiting, so they just leave him there, and later a train does pass by and cuts his body in 2 pieces. These kids were not criminal masterminds. They'd been seen on CCTV. Scores of people remembered their faces. When the police spoke to them, one of them had modeling paint on his shoes. Does this sheer lack of cunningness show they didn't know what they'd done? One of them actually asked a cop if they could make him come alive again, as if he were a broken toy. Barely anyone in the country didn't want to string these 2 kids up by their necks, even though some argued that they literally didn't know the difference between right and wrong and had violent upbringings themselves. "Hang them," shouted some of the public. Age didn't matter to them. These boys were sick in the head. So in 2001, when the boys turned 18, they were released under new identities. The people were again furious. The press had never even been able to photograph them, so how they looked as young adults was a mystery. Even though the outrage-inducing tabloids tried to help them form a picture in their heads, the question was, can people who've done such a horrible thing be rehabilitated? The British system, perhaps quite a bit kinder than the US system, thought the answer was yes. It should be said both boys came from broken homes, with Robert's mom drinking her way through life and almost losing her kids to a care home. John's mom was less prone to violence, but a case report from a social worker said she had a serious depressive problem, which had led to neglect of her children. Venables has now been in and out of trouble all his life, using drugs, drinking, and spending time in prison for various things, including some sexual transgressions. His identity has always been kept a secret because he will be killed and probably killed horribly. The system will always have to protect him. At least Robert Thompson is said to have integrated well into society. Do they even deserve to be living among the public? Many people on the tough streets of northern England still want their pound of flesh. Turning the other cheek is not their thing. They say leopards don't change their spots. Once a killer, always a killer. The USA will soon face a similar predicament, as you will see later on. As for this next killer, he proved that some kids never get better. Ed Kemper. There's a line in a movie that goes, "You tell the angels in heaven you never seen evil so singularly personified as you did in the face of the man who killed you." We imagine that it was true for the victims of Edmund Kemper, a creep, a killer, the literal lover of decapitated heads that he kept in his bed. But what was he like as a youngster? A bundle of joy? It's August 27, 1964. All is quiet in the house of Grandpa and Grandmother Kemper. 15-year-old Ed has been living in their house for a while. Truth be told, he hates his mother with a passion, and living with her is a nightmare. She used to lock him in a dark cellar for days and nights on end with the spiders and the rats, sometimes screaming through the cellar door as the light crept in. "You deserve this, Edmund. This is what happens when you look at a woman's breasts, you disgusting little pervert." Grandmother Kemper is focused on editing a manuscript she's written about Boy Scouts called Boy's Life. Her husband is out doing the grocery shopping. As she's busy with her pen, Ed walks into the kitchen. She says, "Hi, Ed, darling," not even looking up. Ed walks behind her and fires 2 bullets into her head. He then grabs a knife and stabs her 3 times. As her lifeless body drips blood, Ed sits down and waits for the return of his grandfather. He then decides it might be best to take his grandmother's body to one of the bedrooms. Even at 15, he's a hulk of a boy, not far off of the 6'9", 250 pounds he will become. He picks up his grandma like she's a mannequin. As soon as he hears his grandpa's car pull into the driveway, Ed gets up and goes out to greet his grandfather. Ed's always adored the man. He's been his rock in a life of emotional quicksand. As the grandfather gets out of the car, shopping bags in hand, he wonders why Ed's carrying a rifle, although Ed's always messing about with a gun. The grandfather's had to confiscate it now and again because Ed keeps shooting animals. "Hey, buddy," says the grandfather. Ed lets him walk in front and points the end of the .22 rifle at the back of his head about an inch away. Bang! The grandfather drops to the floor and dies instantly. When the cops pick Ed up, this well-spoken boy with an IQ of 145 tells them he did it. They ask why he stabbed his grandmother 3 times after shooting her. Ed replies, "I wanted to make sure. I didn't want her to suffer." But why? Why did you do it in the first place, to people you obviously love? Ed looks at them with a blank expression on his face and says, "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma." That's what evil looks like. It looks unconcerned. It looks normal with the strange undercurrent of the absence of emotion. Heightened senses can see pure evil. These people can feel the coldness of violent psychopathy on their skin. If you look into the lives of serial killers, you start to see patterns. Physical and sexual abuse is common, as is abandonment. In general, being shown no love whatsoever is the story of most serial killers' childhoods. And as with Ed, quite a few serial killers have had absent fathers, very controlling, often narcissistic mothers. Ed's mom physically and psychologically tortured him. She systematically humiliated him. She destroyed every ounce of self-worth he had. This never bodes well for kids, but the vast majority don't end up becoming serial killers. We'll explain why soon. Ed fooled the psychiatrists who later treated him. He played them like fools. He stayed in a psychiatric hospital for a few days. The doctors and staff loved him. They thought he was always friendly and impressively intelligent. Right before Ed was released at the age of 21, one of the psychiatrists wrote, "I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him a danger to himself or to any member of society." He was talking about the same man that later said, "When I meet a pretty girl, one side of me says, I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says, I wonder what her head would look like on a stick." One of the conditions after Ed's release was that he went for regular chats with the psychiatrists, who were now saying Ed's juvenile record should be wiped, as it wasn't fair to have that taint in his good character. That was that. Ed started his life again with a clean record. On September 14, 1972, Ed saw 15-year-old Aiko Ku hitchhiking, so as usual he picked her up. He was already an expert at manipulation and murder. He choked her to death, then went for a beer. He later took her home, dissected her, and buried the body parts. He kept her head though, as he liked to sleep with and play with the heads of his victims. Her head was in the trunk of his car when he went for his usual appointment with his probation psychiatrists. One of them wrote that day, "If I were seeing this patient without having any history available or without getting the history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illness." Another that day said Ed's motorcycle was more of a threat to his life and health than any threat he is presently to anyone else. Ed was eventually convicted of murdering 10 people in all, including his mother, whose head he used as a dartboard. Even after everything he'd done, the many detectives, the Mindhunter guys, and the prison staff and doctors all liked him. Ed was a star and very generous with his answers in interviews. The question is, how did he fool everyone? How do the so-called experts know when a rotten kid should be taken out of society forever? Well, with this next child, it was pretty obvious, but yet again, mistakes were made. Juan Fernando Hermosa. It's 1991 and the 15-year-old Juan Fernando Hermosa is in the mood to cause trouble. He's raging inside, tired of his deaf mother and angry at the fact that his father is hardly ever at home. He spends most of his time hanging around gaming arcades in Ecuador's capital city of Quito. This is the day he gets his gang together for something serious. After drinking away much of the day and later going to a disco, the boys then get in taxis. As the driver pulls up at the destination, Juan pulls out a 9mm pistol and shoots him in the head. The others laugh nervously. Some are quiet, some are afraid. They just killed a man. Wow. They push the dead man into the back and take his car, dumping the body outside town. This is just the beginning of his reign of terror. About a week later, Juan and his gang visit their regular hairdresser, Charlie. After getting haircuts, they invite Charlie to go for drinks and shoot her dead. Make no mistake, Juan is the ringleader. Some of his buddies are just too scared to say anything like, "Murdering people isn't too cool." They know how dangerous he is. Not long ago, he came into school with the head of a cat in his bag, showing it off like it was a Star Wars figure. He'd changed. Ever since he found out he was adopted, something had snapped. Over the next few weeks, bodies kept being found, all shot with a 9mm pistol. 11 of them are the bodies of LGBTQIA people, obviously lured someplace and then executed. 8 are taxi drivers. One time the gang pulls over a truck and they shoot 2 of its occupants. The city is in a panic. Somebody is out there killing people for nothing. A serial killer. The police put together a task force and warn people not to go out alone at night. The gang's downfall happens soon after one of them is caught shoplifting. The cops interrogate the boy, asking him what he knows about the murders. These delinquents all seem to know each other, but the kid keeps quiet. He won't squeal. Well, not until they give him the customary beating that many Ecuadorians in police custody are used to. So the game was up. It was time to bring the young killer in. On the night they planned to capture Juan, they waited until the early hours of the morning and get into his house through a skylight. But Juan heard them and soon pulls out his gun. Bullets flew in the darkness, someone threw a grenade into the room, and then another, and there was so much firepower that a roof collapsed, trapping 2 cops under the rubble. Juan, still not hit, saw his chance and he tried to get out of a window. Hundreds of rounds were fired, but the only person who got hit was Juan's deaf mother. She lay dead with 11 bullet holes in her body as Juan is trying to lower himself down from the window. The place was surrounded and he was taken in, unbelievably with barely a scratch on him. The people of Ecuador couldn't believe the serial killer was just a kid who they named Niño del Terror, the child of terror. As the law stood, he was a minor, and so when the judge handed him 4 years for at least 22 murders, the people were outraged. The judge asked Juan why. Why did you kill them? Juan said he would have let them live had they just kept quiet. He was a psycho, no doubt about it. As psychos are apt to do, he became a leader in juvenile prison, not through brute force, but through his cunningness. He even managed to get a gun snuck in for him. On June 17, 1993, he led a group of 10 young prisoners outside the prison with that gun, shooting a cop 5 times on the way. After that, he fled to Colombia but was captured again and then sent home. Incredibly, they let him finish his short sentence and he was let out in 1996. He was free, but he was wanted. In Ecuador, you don't shoot cops and kill innocent civilians and then just get away with it. Just after Juan's 20th birthday in another city while living with his father, 5 men in hoods over their heads get a hold of him. His body is later found. He'd been horrifically tortured, cut to pieces with a machete, and then shot so many times he looked like a human showerhead. To many people in the country, that was justice. Rough justice maybe, but necessary. Leopards, they say, don't change their spots. This one had to be put down. At the end of the time, the media around the world was saying no child on Earth had been that evil. What kind of kid starts serial killing at 15? They obviously had very short memories. Eric Borel. For decades, people have tried to figure out what went wrong with this next kid. This is what we'll say about evil. When the brain is wired a certain way and the environment is ripe for wretchedness, you can get something monstrous. Maybe that's what evil is, when nature and nurture perfectly intertwine to form a human weapon of mass destruction, when the wicked components of the environment and biology don't cancel each other out but make a highly destructive compound. Such as with Eric Borel, whose fundamentally religious mother beat the hell out of him and told him he was a child of sin. Most kids would be traumatized, but their frontal lobes would come to their rescue and tell them not to go through with what they wanted to do in their dark fantasies. Not with Eric. Eric's frontal lobes hissed and fizzed as he had an emotional short circuit. Here's the story. The year is 1995. Eric is quiet in school. He studies electromechanics and he's not a bad student. When he finishes school, he goes home to admire the pictures on his wall, old photos of his hero, Adolf Hitler. Swastikas are painted above his bed. Books about war and war crimes are scattered around. He has a particular interest in America's Waco siege. Today, he has a plan. It's September 23rd, and at the age of 16, Eric takes an Anschutz .22 caliber rifle into the family kitchen and shoots his stepfather 4 times. That's not enough. Gritting his teeth in anger, he takes a hammer to the dead man's head. It's early evening, so as usual, Eric's stepbrother is watching TV in the living room. After hearing the screams, he turns around to see Eric staring at him from the living room door. Within a minute or two, he's dead, suffering the same fate as his father. Covered in blood from head to toe, Eric grabs the TV remote and turns over the channel. He waits patiently for his mother to return from the place where she's learned he is sinful, her beloved church. At 8:30 p.m., she enters the house saying, "Hi, I'm home." She screams when she sees her husband's bashed-in head. Bang! One shot, she's dead. For some reason, Eric doesn't go to work on her with a hammer. We'll never know why. Outside, in their beautiful, scenic village of Souliers-Pont in southeastern France, it's quiet. He looks outside, thinking about his next move, and then covers the bodies under sheets. He takes a backpack and fills it with cookies, a raincoat, a map, some cash, and a handgun that fires only rubber bullets. He packs a bunch of real ammunition into his pockets, and now, dressed in all black with a rifle strapped to his back, he begins what he regards as his one-man blitzkrieg through pastoral France. He walks through the wilderness alone, passing sprawling vineyards and terraced orchards. Now and again, he stops to rest, having a cookie or two while thinking about what he's going to do. It's almost 7 in the morning when he gets to the next village, another quiet place famous for its wine. Eric looks at a house. He knocks on the door, and his buddy from school answers, 17-year-old Alain Guillemette. What happens next, we don't know, but it seems Eric wants something from Alain. They talk in the garden for a while, and then Alain sends Eric on his way. As Alain turns, Eric blasts him in the back, killing him. Eric walks through the town. It's getting busier now. No one thinks anything is wrong. It's hunting season, rifles are a common sight, and murder is almost unheard of in this part of rural France. Then Eric gets to the town square, calmly brings the rifle sight up to his eye and starts firing at anyone. One witness says it was like a Hollywood movie. It was surreal. One woman is bringing out the trash when she is shot and killed. Eric runs closer to a house in which he can see people. He takes aim and fires, killing an elderly woman and injuring her husband. The neighbor pulls back the blinds and the next to see what all the commotion's about, and Eric shoots her dead. He then kills another elderly man who's drinking coffee outside on a terrace. Eric moves again, firing at 2 young boys. One, just 15, is killed on his way to buy baguettes. He shoots a shopkeeper, a man buying a newspaper, and a guy at an ATM. He kills an old man walking his dog who's on his way to play boula with his retired buddies. Now people are running, alarms are ringing, and the fire brigade is out. People are diving under cars, jumping into doorways as this young psycho keeps firing. Finally, he's chased toward a vineyard, but doesn't get there. He walks over to a cypress tree and his life ends there. Many people have been seriously injured. The death toll will be 15. But why? Because his mother called him evil and his real father wasn't around? No, it's as we said, certain bad elements all have to meet to create something so purely and demonstrably malevolent. People read in the papers that Eric sympathized with Hitler and that he liked the movies Terminator and The Silence of the Lambs, and that he had a thing about guns and the military, but it still didn't make sense. With this in mind, we come to our last 2 evil children who, if you meet them in the USA today, you might do well to turn on your psychosensitivity radar. Eric Smith. August 2nd, 1993, a 4-year-old child named Derek Joseph Robbie is playing outside his quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Steuben County, New York. There's another kid playing outside. 13-year-old Eric Smith, a bespectacled kid who's the perfect picture of youthful fragility. Eric seems like a normal kid. He has loving parents, he's not even close to being impoverished, but he's experienced many problems. With his small frame, his glasses, bright red hair, and his speech impediment, he gets bullied at school almost daily. He's beaten up frequently. Inside him is an unaddressed anger that is about to explode into something terrifying. Both boys are on their way to summer camp on their bicycles when Eric stops the younger boy in his tracks. For whatever reason, and for a reason perhaps only the devil himself knows, Smith gets hold of Derek. This is not to bully him or even hit him with his fists. There's something beyond rational thinking. Eric strangles the boy and leaves him for dead. He then thinks about what he's done. He has time to consider the product of his rage, and he isn't done. Never mind in shock. He takes a large rock and drops it on Derek's head. Eric actually has taken the time to dig up 2 rocks and chosen the larger one. If this isn't macabre enough, he takes the Kool-Aid from Derek's lunchbox and wipes it into the open wounds. Police see the body is left posed, as serial killers sometimes do when they take great enjoyment from their work. Posing bodies for serial killers is their art form, the pièce de résistance of their signature. A 13-year-old doing this is unheard of in the annals of murder. A few days later, Eric looks at his mom and tells her, "Mom, I did it. I killed Derek." His mom wants this to be a lie, a strange fantasy, but he is telling the truth. On November 7, 1993, Eric was convicted and sentenced to 9 years to life, to be served in a young offenders prison and later an adult prison. In 2002, the parole board agreed that Eric, then 22, showed little remorse. 2 years later, he started talking about his murders a bit more. He admitted what he'd done was terrible, explaining that the bullying he'd faced made him take his emotional anger and rage out on someone who had done nothing to bring on such violence. In 2009, just before another parole hearing, he told the journalist that all that anger inside him back then was saved for other kids that tormented him. He said, "If I could switch places with him and take the grave for him to live, I'd do it in a second." The Robbie family didn't believe a word of this. The attack wasn't one strike with a bat, a knife plunged in rage. It was sustained torture, the work of a maniac. In 2021, during his 11th parole board hearing, Eric said he just wanted a normal life. A wife, a job, and kids, and after a risk assessment, he was granted parole. He's now free. He'll have to see parole officers until his dying day, and if he commits a violent crime, he can kiss goodbye his freedom for the rest of his life. Still, the Robbie family is furious. The question is, will that rage reappear? This is what some Brits said would happen to the kids who tortured and killed Jamie Bolger. But while there have been some issues, those boys haven't resorted to extreme violence again. Is Eric now cured? Is that even possible? Can you rehabilitate a killer when he committed a crime that brutal? This is a question you need to ask yourself because this next killer will be released at some point too. Alyssa Bustamante. October 21, 2009, St. Martins, Missouri. 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante has a plan, an utterly wicked plan. This is a girl with issues. Her father's in prison, her mother is an addict, so she lives with her grandmother. She has no sense of self-worth. She hates herself and takes it out on herself. She's lacking the love and attention all children deserve. But that doesn't excuse what she does next. She's like a million troubled girls and boys in America, but the difference is she's ready to commit evil deeds. She's experienced the nurture and nature that is destined to create the wicked compound we talked about. On this day, she's hanging out at her grandparents' large property, the perfect place for adventures. Most of the time, she does enjoy running around the woods and even attending her Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But today, she has something very different on her mind. She tells her younger sister to go get that girl that lives down the street to come out and play. 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton. That she does, and Elizabeth never returns home. Elizabeth's mom calls the police, and the next day they turn up at Alyssa's house asking questions. "Have you seen this girl? She was out playing with you. Where did she go?" Alyssa, almost grinning inside, tells them she has no idea where little Elizabeth is. Earlier, she'd written in her diary, "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them, and now they're dead. I don't know how to feel, ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the 'oh my god, I can't do this' feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I gotta go to church now, LOL." The cops find this diary in her messy bedroom, which has dark poetry written on the walls and some words written in what looks like blood. In the diary, one entry says how she plans to burn her house down with everyone in it. Another entry says, "When I explode, someone is going to die." Police see what looks like a shallow grave close to Alyssa's house. Little do they know, Alyssa dug that grave 5 days before she committed the murder. The crime wasn't a moment of unfettered, suppressed rage. It was carefully planned. The police discovered that Alyssa had taken the girl to a wooded area, strangled her, slit her throat, and stabbed her repeatedly in the stomach. Psychiatrists later said this kind of behavior was partly due to a major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. As for Alyssa, she said she just wanted to know what it would feel like to take someone's life. The victim's mother called Alyssa an evil monster. Who could argue with that? She was appalled when the judge sentenced Alyssa to life in prison with the possibility of conditional release in 2024, and that is coming up soon. In 2021, someone started a petition called Repeal Law that could free Elizabeth Olten's murderer, Alyssa Bustamante, within 3 years. So far, it has 3,565 signatures of the 5,000 target. One of the last comments reads, "She doesn't deserve any kind of freedom. This is more than she deserves, being fed and living. Elizabeth didn't get to have her life with her family. I'm Elizabeth's mother's friend, and there is nothing I would love more than to see Alyssa pay for her evil the rest of her life." Who do you think are the worst out of these killer kids?
We heard a story while researching this show about how one boy played a nasty trick on his parents. He told his younger brother to lie lifeless on the concrete floor outside the family house under a bedroom window. He then ran to his parents, who were quietly watching TV in the living room, and, feigning panic, told them their young son, aged about 8, had fallen from the upstairs window and was unconscious, maybe dead. For maybe a minute or two, the parents thought they might have lost a child, but then discovered the young boy wasn't even there. He'd lost his nerve and backed out, and the older brother, to say the least, was in trouble. Can you get meaner than that? That's what we'll find out today, in this episode of the infographic show, Meanest Pranks Kids Can Pull on Their Parents. We should first add a warning. Some of these really are very mean pranks. That's why we use the superlative meanest. But please be careful, as some parents might react badly to some of these pranks, such as the mysterious underwear prank, which could cause huge problems. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 10, the tattoo. Okay, so we saw this story on one website, but can't seem to find the source of it. Is it true? Well, if it isn't, we'll talk about it anyway, as it's quite amusing. A young American girl of Moroccan descent and from a strict Muslim family decides to prank her mother by texting her and informing her that she got drunk. The outraged mother loses her head, especially when the girl then adds that she did not only partake in drinking, but also got a tattoo. The enraged mother then apparently really loses it, telling the daughter that she is no longer her daughter. She also threatens to send her back to Morocco. There she will have to live in shame for what she has done. The daughter then tells the truth and says she was just kidding. She returns home and is greeted with a shoe thrown at her head. It seems she wasn't sent back to Morocco in the end. Okay, so someone may have made that up, but later in the show, we will get to much meaner pranks that have definitely been done. At the same time, there are plenty of websites out there right now offering very realistic fake tattoos. Why not get one on your face, perhaps a tear under the eye, or a lover's name on your neck? See how mom and dad deal with it. Preferably do the tear after a big family bust-up. Say nothing, just roll up for dinner as if nothing has happened. Some momentary tattoos out there don't just wash off immediately. Number 9, autocorrect. Okay, so many kids have parents who you might say are technologically challenged. A writer on one website said one thing he did was to grab one of his parents' smartphones while they weren't looking. If there is no password and you can get into the phone settings, you can then start to cause havoc. It's fairly simple to change the autocorrect settings to what you want. You could of course totally embarrass your parents, if they hit send that is, and input all kinds of expletives or sexual words for normal words. Maybe you could change cook, or fork, or any word you choose. The parent may not even know how to change this back, so even if they spot the mistake, the new settings will drive them up the wall. Number 8, mess with their underwear. There are plenty of websites out there that talk about a pretty tame prank kids can pull, and that's just hiding all their parents' underwear before they go to bed so that they have nothing in the morning and may have to go to work commando. Then you could hide their underwear and leave only their most ridiculous stuff. But we think there's a much meaner prank to pull, and it's very simple. First, look to see what kind of underwear your parents wear. Then once you have the style down, go out and either buy a totally different style of underwear for either your mom or your dad, make sure it's the sexy type, perhaps gaudy but sexy, then wait until the parent you plan to prank goes out for a night or away for a weekend. Just before that parent gets back, leave the strange sexy underwear somewhere around the house. Kitchen is a good spot, as is the living room or even the bedroom. See what happens next. Okay, so that's very mean. We will add some hilarious things to the list too. Number 7, fake lottery tickets. You could say this one is very much hilarious. You can actually buy fake lottery tickets on Amazon, and the prices can be pretty high. They are the scratch card kind, of course. Now the one thing about this prank is knowing how to set it up. You can't exactly plant one of these tickets in the local store unless you know the person who works there. You could just leave one around the house, but that looks rather sketchy. You could pretend you'd found it and just give it to your parents, or even tell them you'd bought one yourself. This could of course be a pretty mean trick if your parents have financial problems and believing they just won $20,000 feels like being given a lifeline. It might also be quite embarrassing trying to collect the bounty. Number 6, what a horrible mess. This is an oldie but a goodie, and it's likely to get you into a fair bit of trouble. If you want a step-by-step instructional guide as to how to do this, just go over to the website WikiHow. You basically take some saran wrap or cellophane and head to the bathroom. Then just lift up the toilet seat and carefully place the wrap over the bowl. Then you put the seat back down. Obviously, the wrap must be placed well so there are no wrinkles in it. It works better in a bathroom where the lighting is dim. It also works better when you've laid your trap after your parents have eaten dinner. A number 1 just results in pee being splashed on the floor. A number 2 will cause some amount of parental distress. Number 5, the booze switch. Now, many teens out there may have occasionally raided mom and dad's liquor cabinet or booze stash. You all know that to do this, you may have to water down that vodka or gin as it may look low to your parents. The good news is that at least you're doing their livers a favor. But a more fun prank is to empty one of their bottles completely and put the real booze in another bottle that you have hidden. Then pour water into the bottle and wait. It might be best to do this when your parents have guests and plan to drink. This one might also not get you into too much trouble, if you still have the alcohol, that is. Number 4, Mom, I'm pregnant. This one's for the ladies. If you are way too young to be mothering a child, the better. Or you might even set it up by telling your mother you've been hanging out with this really cool teacher guy. You could also just let it slip that your period is late this month, but say nothing else. There are 2 ways you can fake the test. Either buy a fake test online that always shows positive, or rig a real test. Let's think about the latter, as those real tests are available everywhere. A test shows positive when HCG appears in a urine sample. How to make that happen? You have a few options. You can find a pregnant girl to pee on the strip, though that probably won't be easy. One website tells us putting Coca-Cola on the strip can do the job, and a really easy way is just drawing a line on the strip yourself. You can also try heating the test, as this can give false positives. Coloring your urine can work, and even putting soap in the urine works. Once that is done, it's time to tell mom and dad there will be a new addition to the family. Number 3, evil posters. This one is very easy, but can cause all kinds of trouble. Basically, make a poster. You can do that online with something like Canva, and you need 0 skills. Preferably upload an image from the net of a very good-looking woman or man. This can be a prank for either parent. And once you add a sexy poster, add the phone number of your intended victim. Looking for a good time? Call this number. Post these posters around town where you might find such posters, or make small cards and leave them around. All you have to do then is wait for all the awkward phone calls. Hi Victoria, I'm calling about the ad I saw. How much exactly, and what kind of services are you offering? Number 2, steal something your parents won't dare inquire about. This is also a very easy trick to play, but the best thing about it is that the effect it has is manifesting an angry silence. Take something from your parents that they keep in secret. In the old days, this could have been porn magazines your dad kept hidden. We say old days because not too many people look at magazines anymore. If your mom keeps a sexy toy, then take that. Once you have sequestered whatever it is they keep hidden, just say nothing. What you will see is confusion and anger developing, but no words will be spoken. Well, it's unlikely many moms would ask their son, "Hey, have you seen my dildo?" Number 1, head in a jar. Okay, as always, we will try and end with something lighter. Well, you could say it's both dark and light. You'll need a large jar for this. Next, you will need a color printout of your face as close to the real size as you can get. Then you will have to laminate that image. You then fill the jar with an oily kind of substance, like brine. You could use any oily substance. You need to put your laminated face in the jar with the brine, ensuring that the image fits the glass. We've seen images of this online, and indeed it looks like a head in a jar. You can just Google head in a jar prank and you'll find some very creepy images and instructions. Anyway, follow those instructions and hopefully you'll be able to replicate the trick with your own head, or even your brother's or sister's head. Put that jar in the fridge and leave the house. Preferably do this when you have been out for some time and there are a couple of missed calls to you from your parents. They will open the fridge and have the shock of their lives. Okay, we must remind you again that these pranks could really turn bad. Head in a jar could cause a heart attack, or at least a lot of sadness and the police being called. If you do perform a prank, perhaps try and do it so you can very quickly undo it. We don't condone pulling pranks on your parents, but we would encourage you to draw them something cute.
On August 18, 1989, 2 brothers named Eric and Lyle Menendez walked into a Big 5 sporting goods store in San Diego and bought themselves 2 Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns. These were no ordinary kids. They were what you might call ultra-wealthy Beverly Hills boys. They lived in a stunning palatial mansion in the heart of the playground of the rich and famous. A day after they bought the guns, their parents, Jose and Kitty, chartered a yacht and took the boys shark fishing, which is apparently nothing out of the ordinary for a family swimming in money. What is unusual is the next day the boys entered a room where their father was watching television and unloaded the shotguns on their mother and father. Welcome to one of America's most confounding true crime stories. First of all, they did it. They admitted to it, and that's that. They fired the shots, made damn sure both were dead, and then went to a movie to watch Batman. We kid you not. This sounds like a simple open and shut case, but just hold on a second because as you shall see, this bloody tale takes many turns. We're a long way from getting the Scooby-Doo rip the mask off criminal ending. Let's start by telling you how this family got so incredibly rich. We've seen the house, and it befits a queen or someone just as important who also has a penchant for buying big places such as Evander Holyfield. That multi-million-dollar property was bought with hard-earned cash. Jose Enrique Menendez escaped the Cuban Revolution and arrived on the U.S. shores just at 16 years old. He studied hard and a few years later had an accounting degree. He later met Kitty, a teacher, but she gave that up while Jose was making a ton of cash as an entertainment executive. Their children went to the best schools and grew up with everything a child might need in terms of material goods. They might not have been shown much love, but we'll get around to that later. Eric had an acumen for tennis and at one point was ranked 44th best male player in the country under 18. His grades weren't too impressive though. Lyle got into Princeton, but he was also on the bottom rung of the academic ladder and even got suspended for plagiarizing work. So we have two rich kids, one a university dropout, and the other a tennis hopeful. At the time of the murders, Lyle was 21 and Eric was 18. With a bit of hard work, both of them were pretty much guaranteed to be set for life. That house was well worth over $10 million, and we expect that the father might have said, "One day, kids, this'll be all yours." There's a chance that if Eric hadn't decided to remove his parents' faces with a hail of bullets, he might have been challenging the likes of Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi. Back to that fateful night. After killing their parents, they changed into some clean clothes, saw Batman, and then they dumped the guns. They returned home, and that's when they called the cops and pretended to be shocked. Lyle called 911 and tearfully he said, "Someone killed our parents." When the police arrived, Eric was rolling around on the lawn in the fetal position, howling in tears. How did it go down? The cops wondered. The investigation revealed that the murderers had just walked into the room where the father was watching TV and shot him in the back of the head. He died instantly and was almost decapitated. Kitty heard the shots and she entered the room, whereupon she was shot in the leg. She tried to run, but slipped on her own blood. While crawling helplessly on the floor, she was shot in the chest and arms. The coup de grace was a shot to her face, which left her unrecognizable. Both of them also had shots to the kneecaps. These execution-style murders looked to the cops like the work of organized crime, and for some reason the kids weren't suspects at the start. They didn't even go through gunshot residue tests to check if they'd used a gun. Seeing as they stood to inherit many millions, you would have thought they'd be prime suspects, but at first none of the evidence pointed to them doing it. Then, they did some reckless things. In the months after the murders, what we might call the mourning period, the two brothers were seemingly having the time of their lives. Lyle purchased a cafe because, hey, why not? He also got himself a very expensive Rolex and a Porsche Carrera. He wore one of the Rolexes to the funeral, and on the way there, in a limo, he talked about how he was going to the US Open. He was seen with his dearly departed father's secretary. She would later testify that Lyle had said, "Hey, Marcy, who said I couldn't fill my father's shoes?" That's because he was actually wearing his father's shoes. Marcy was not impressed and somewhat nonplussed about the icy statement. Eric got himself a new tennis coach. Both boys took trips and spent a fair bit of cash in London and the Caribbean. They bought condos in Marina del Rey and ate at some very expensive restaurants in LA, driving there at times in their deceased mother's Mercedes-Benz SL convertible. The cops, meanwhile, were looking at other entertainment executives that might have had a beef with Jose. He was, after all, well known for being crude and shrewd in business. They also looked into any mob connections, but no one really had any motive to kill Jose, and especially Kitty. If it was an assassination by an enemy, then Kitty was likely just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But who else might want to take both of them out, instead of just killing Jose and then escaping? Yeah, those kids were spending money like Mike Tyson after his first big paycheck. The cops were onto them, and so told one of Eric's friends to wear a wire and ask him if he did it. Eric said no, he didn't, but he did confess to his psychologists. That psychologist didn't breach doctor-patient confidentiality, but he did tell his mistress what Eric had told him. She then told the cops. At this point, the boys think that they're in the clear. Lyle's hired some bodyguards for when he goes shopping and spends thousands of dollars at a time. Both brothers have also just created a real estate and entertainment business called Menendez Investment Enterprises. The two were interviewed numerous times about their loss and what they wanted to do with the money. They saw fame and wealth ahead, and Eric even said they might get into politics. He said, "My brother wants to become president of the United States. and I want to be a senator and be with the people of Cuba. He even said he felt his father's ghost inside him, pushing him to do good in Cuba. People swallowed the story hook, line, and sinker, but the cops saw two rats. So the police have been told that the boys did it. They arrested Lyle since he was in California, and then Eric was arrested after he came home after playing a tennis tournament in Israel. The case wasn't simple, though. In court, a judge ruled that the therapy session tapes could be used as evidence, but the boys had hired the best lawyers and they fought that for over a year. Around 3 years after the murders, both boys were eventually indicted for murder. In both cases, the juries were deadlocked, which means they couldn't come to an agreement. The boys sat in court, sometimes in almost matching sweaters, looking like two wealthy Ivy League students who were on their way to the country club. How come they weren't immediately found guilty and sent to prison? Can you imagine if some poor dudes from South Central had admitted to the crime? Would they get a hung jury? The defense argued that both boys had been molested throughout their childhood, and that's why they riddled their parents' bodies with bullets, kneecapped them, and removed substantial parts of their heads. The defense was good, too very good. The Washington Post at the time called her a star attorney, adding that she was a 4'11", fire-eating, mudslinging, nuclear-strength pain in the legal butt. She told the jury about how these two noble young men had been savagely brutalized from infancy right up until the day their despicable parents got what they deserved. These two lost souls were both paragons of humanity, she argued. The angels had their youth taken away from them by two ghastly parents who couldn't keep their hands to themselves. You get the picture. She was convincing and delivered an oratory matching the words of William Shakespeare. The boys sobbed too and told a tale of household horror that wouldn't look out of place in hell. The defense lawyer told the jury that before the kids did what they did, they approached the parents and told them that if they didn't quit molesting them, they would go to the cops and ruin both of them. She said that those mean parents in no uncertain terms said, "Try that and see what happens." The two kids feared retaliation and had no choice but to go and buy 2 shotguns and then shoot the molesters down in a hail of bullets. As for that big spending, well, it was just a way of dealing with things. The thing is, was she telling the truth? Well, the two people who could corroborate what she said were both dead. A cousin did come forward and support the boy's story, so that counted for something. The brothers cried when questioned in court, and you might have felt pity for them, but the vast majority of the American public weren't buying it. The boys cried, and the public for the most part mocked what they said were crocodile tears. The skepticism was so rife that even Saturday Night Live mocked the brothers. The kids said the father was the instigator of the abuse, but the mother was also demonic in her own way. They said she was selfish, mentally unstable, and after eating a handful of benzos washed down with a quart of vodka, she could become violent. It worked for a while, but then there was a second trial, and in that trial, the judge would not permit the defense to use abuse claims. He also said that the jury couldn't vote for a manslaughter charge. On April 2, 1996, both brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For 22 years, they didn't see each other, but then in 2018, they were housed in the same unit, and when they met, they burst into tears and embraced. They've both been married and done quite a few interviews. One of the brothers said in one such interview, "I'm the kid who did kill his parents, and no rivers of tears has changed that." In a famous interview, Eric says, "I'm just a normal kid." The interviewer says, "You're a normal kid who killed his parents." He then says in a hushed tone, "I know." He even added that he admired his father, saying he was everything that success was. Some supporters of the children say their father might not have been a physical kind of abuser, but he was a powerful man that ruled over the house with an iron fist. He was what you might call an overbearing father. Friends of the family have said that Jose was somewhat tyrannical and he bullied his own kids. A child psychologist who has reviewed the case said it was the younger brother who was the victim of most of the abuse, and the older brother defended him. He believes the boys told the truth and the public that mocked the boys are wrong. But why kill the mother and shoot her 10 times? The psychologist replied, "I've talked with the boys about this and it's something that they don't fully understand. She was a very painful part of their lives, throughout their lives, and a person who they would have seen as not protecting them. She would turn up the television set if one of them was off in another room being physically abused by their father." The cousin who corroborated the brother's story has also spoken out of late, and he still states that Lyle told him during his childhood that the father was doing things no father should ever do. Then you have people who say criminals often use such excuses when they're held accountable for a crime. One psychologist said, "They say whatever they believe will gain them a sympathetic ear, and thereby minimize unpalatable consequences. They may claim that they were abused when it never occurred." There are those that argue that the brothers didn't use the so-called abuse excuse and that they have been unfairly treated by the justice system and that people have mocked them. The journalists and documentary makers have slanted their stories to make them look spoiled, selfish, and ultimately culpable of a heinous crime. Perhaps the public has treated these boys harshly, only because some envy the boys' wealth. Maybe people have biases toward kids who are labeled as spoiled brats, or maybe they were spoiled and selfish and out for some inheritance. The mother might have been a pill-popping malcontent married to a tyrannical man whose yearning for success dehumanized him, but that shouldn't have resulted in them both being shot to pieces. Then again, you might question why those kids murdered their parents in such a fashion. Wasn't one bullet enough? Where did that rage come from? Maybe these kids deserve another trial and those abuse allegations should be accepted. Some say yay to that and others resoundingly say nay. We can't solve the mystery for you, and so there will be no Scooby-Doo reveal today. We can't lift the mask from the past and see what went down inside the walls of that mansion. We can say one thing for sure though, and that's that money can't buy happiness. A woman is sleeping next to her husband when she's woken up by the slow creaking of a door. She opens her eyes and notices the time on the alarm clock reads 4:23 a.m. Turning to her side, she's suddenly startled. Her 4-year-old is standing at the edge of the bed, not saying anything, but just pointing in the direction of his bedroom. "Mom," he says in a tremulous voice, "someone is sleeping in my bed, a boy with no face." Understandably, the mother is in a state of shock. She shoves her husband, waking him up. Upon investigation, there is no boy with no face. "It was just a dream, darling," the mom assures her son. For the rest of the night, he sleeps in their bed. As for the mother, she can't sleep at all. The image of her dead brother haunts her thoughts, his burned face that she saw after the fire, a fire that she'd accidentally started when they were both in their teens. Several months pass, and then one night the mom is woken again. This time it's a loud bang that shakes her out of her slumber. It came from her son's bedroom. To her surprise, the alarm yet again reads 4:23 a.m. She doesn't give it much thought and instead goes to her son's bedroom where the noise seemed to come from. She finds her son shaking in the bed, the covers pulled up almost to his eyes. His toy desk and all the things that were on it are scattered around the room. The mom then shivers after a cold breeze passes over her. She looks to the window where the curtains are flailing in the wind. Her kid isn't tall enough to open that window. She looks back to her son. He says to her feebly, "He's behind you, Mom." Yeah, she was freaked out all right, but you won't be surprised to hear that there was no one behind her. On top of that, that kid never said he saw the boy with no face again. What's troubling though is sometime after the second time the kid saw the boy, the mom remembered that her brother had died in the hospital around 4 in the morning. You might think that's a strange story or a tall tale, but it's a fact that quite a large number of children claim to see things that are not there, or at least that adults can't see. Number 6. Uninvited guest. A couple had for a while been looking for a new place to live. They'd searched high and low, but as of yet hadn't found anything they thought would be suitable for them and their 3-year-old girl. They finally found what looked to them to be the ideal place. It was a 3-bedroom flat in a large building in Chicago that dated back to 1911. The family moved in. After the first night, when they were out shopping, the mom asked her daughter how she felt about the place. Did she like it? The daughter's exact words were, "Yeah, and that little boy that lives there is really nice too." The mother was taken aback and asked, "What little boy?" The daughter told her that she'd seen a boy in his pajamas and he'd waved at her. She said he was about the same age as her. She'd only seen him in the dining room, but he was there all the time. The mother later recalled that her daughter had told her his name, but she'd forgotten it. One thing she did remember her daughter telling her was that the boy was scared of water. The mom took this pretty seriously. She even started to look things up on the internet about how to clear a troubled spirit from a house. She wasn't exactly comfortable with the fact that her daughter was convinced a boy was living with them, at least a spectral boy. But the daughter never talked about him again, not even when she was asked to. As you'll see, such sightings are very common. Maybe you don't believe the moms and pops telling the stories, but there are so many of them. We very much doubt all of them are making the stories up. Our next ghost story was so intense, it was studied by professional psychologists who were left stumped. Number 5. A Chinese-American horror story. This one's a bit more serious and was actually written about in an academic paper called A Child Who Sees Ghosts Every Night, Manifestations of Psychosocial and Familial Stress. It's the story of a Chinese boy who had moved to the USA. In his new country at the age of 8, he started to see ghosts. This wasn't a one-off. He saw them all the time, at least until he was age 10. And that's when his parents became so concerned they sent him to see a child psychologist. Obviously, they didn't think he was seeing ghosts, but he really did think he was. In fact, when the child psychologist tried to tell him it was his imagination or he was dreaming, he became quite upset. He was absolutely sure that what he was seeing was real. He talked about 2 ghosts that he had seen in his house. At the time, the parents dismissed this, but he kept going on about them all the time. The psychologist spent more time with the kid and later told the parents that he was not hallucinating these ghosts and he wasn't suffering from something like psychosis. Okay, so what was happening? Well, the answer is no one really knew. The psychologist said the ghosts were likely a result of stress from moving to the US. That's the scientific take on things. But then that kid certainly isn't alone regarding the fact that he swore he could see dead people. As you'll find out in our next story, though many children may grow out of seeing ghosts, sometimes a younger sibling can confirm the terrifying apparitions an older child used to complain about. Number 4. Who the hell is Jordan? This also involves someone moving into a new house. It was a family from Des Moines, Iowa. They just moved when the young daughter of the family walked into the living room one day and said to her mom, "Mom, why is there a man standing in the kitchen?" The mother immediately thought an intruder had broken in, so violence more than anything else was on her mind. Her partner was out at work, and so the only people in the house were her and her 1- and 3-year-old daughters. She bravely walked toward the kitchen and shouted, "Hello!" No one answered, so she just walked in. To her relief, there was no one there. No strange man, no neighbor, no husband. The mom then asked her daughter what the man she'd seen looked like. The daughter replied that he was a big man with no hair, and he was old, like Dad. The mother just thought her child had a fecund imagination, and so she didn't think any more about it. Only when it happened again, she became concerned. Then they started to do a bit of research. She found out that the house was built in 1912. Prior to them moving in, one family had lived there for 49 years, but there were no murders there or strange deaths, or at least none that she could discover. Not long after doing the research, her daughter approached her again while she was alone in bed. This time she said, "Why is that man lying in the bed?" The mom asked, "Where in the bed?" her hair standing on end. Her daughter pointed to where her father would usually sleep. When the mom looked at where her daughter was pointing, there was no one there. Yet again, the mom asked what the guy looked like, and yet again the daughter replied, "Tall, with no hair, old, like Dad." The daughter saw more things. Sometimes she claimed to hear laughter outside. Other times she said she saw a person walking outside the house. To the shock of her father, she once told him someone was standing behind him when they were both down in the basement. The girl also claimed to see 2 little kids called Luna and Jordan. Thoughts of the movie The Shining flickered in the mother's mind. Not long after, something almost flipped the mother over the edge. She collected the mail one morning to find a letter that wasn't addressed to the family. It was for someone called Jordan. She did some more research and found out that no one in the family that had lived there before them was named Jordan. But who was Jordan? Who was the letter for? After the family decided to put a fence in the garden that separated their house and the neighbor's house, it seemed the ghosts were not so happy about it. Soon, the woman said the dogs started howling for no reason. In her own words, she said, "My TV turned on at about 2 in the morning while the remotes were on top of the TV stand and the dogs were fast asleep. Also, it takes 2 remotes to turn on my TV. The floodlight on my garage, disconnected over a year ago, randomly turned on and was shining into my house." She also said at times the smoke detector would sound by itself, but when she went to turn it off, it would just shut down before she got there. Her eldest daughter stopped talking about the ghosts after a couple of years, but when her other daughter turned 3, she started talking to things that weren't there. Sometimes she'd ask her mom who the girl in the house was. One time she said, "Why is that girl crying?" There was no one there, of course. Then something happened that finally convinced the mom to believe in ghosts. One day, her youngest daughter asked her where the children went when they were not at home. She asked her daughter what kids she was talking about. This is the exact response she got. "Those kids with dirty faces, they say, 'Shoo, shoo,' you know, Luna and Cookie." You can explain children seeing ghosts away as them having an overactive imagination. But what do you do when your child can perfectly describe someone who died long before they were born? Number 3, a visit from Grandpa. Many years before a husband and wife met, the father of the husband died after coming down with the flu. The son had felt very guilty about this because he too had had the flu at the same time, but he'd gotten through it okay. The guilt subsided over the years, but it didn't completely go. Still, when the couple had a baby boy, they were over the moon, and memories of the death were replaced with the joy of giving birth to a beautiful baby boy. However, one day that boy, a boy that had never ever seen a picture of his deceased grandpa, went up to his pop one morning and said, "Daddy, Papa Don wanted me to tell you he's doing fine." This not only shocked the father, but it almost reduced him to tears. He then asked his son to describe the person he thought he had met. The kid not only described his grandpa perfectly, but he also said when he saw him outside, he was standing next to a racing car with smoke all around his head. This shocked the pop even more because his father had raced cars, and to his discredit, he was a big fan of smoking cigarettes. Our next spooky story was so disturbing it made national headlines. Number 2, the convict. This story appeared in the British national media. Like the others, it's pretty strange, but experts in the field of child psychology don't deny it happened. In fact, one expert said 18 million young kids in the UK have seen ghosts. One of them is called Veda. When she was a kid, she thought that some guy had escaped from prison and had somehow gotten into her house and chased her up the stairs. Needless to say, she was pretty scared that day. She told her mom, saying the guy was fastened to a ball and chain. The mother didn't actually think it was a real ex-con that had broken into her house and chased her kid. Let's face it just wasn't plausible that somehow a convict had gotten into the house without her seeing. Also, no one in the UK has worn a ball and chain for many, many years, and even if someone was connected to a heavy ball and chain, they couldn't be running up the stairs. But young Veda went a step further. She then started telling her mom that she saw an old woman hanging out outside the house. One time, she and her mom were just pulling out of the driveway when Veda pointed and said, "She's there." There was no one there. Veda said she saw a man sitting on the side of her bed. In her own words, she'd also said she saw this. "On other occasions, I was in my bedroom playing with toy cars, and 2 little girls would join me, about the same age, and we'd just chat and play cars." She actually said she saw dead people in her house and a real grumpy ghost in her grandmother's house. She didn't stop seeing such things until she hit her teens. While psychologists tell us it's perfectly okay for very young kids to talk about ghosts, Veda took it to another level. According to one academic writing for Psychology Today, one of the reasons kids see ghosts is often because they feel stressed. That could be the reason so many kids see ghosts when they move to a different house. It's actually the ghosts that are kind of helping the kid get through the difficult situation. That's why they make them up, according to the expert. There's also something in evolutionary psychology called agency detection mechanisms. The theory says we've evolved to think something might do us harm so we can get ready to protect ourselves. Maybe you're walking down a really dark street and you hear something, and then you think you see a shadow. Your mind quickly thinks, "Damn, something's gonna hurt me." Except it turns out that that thing was just a cat. You might have overreacted, but in terms of evolution, it's better than underreacting since it made you prepared to fight or flight. Kids just possibly don't know the difference between an imaginary overreaction and the real thing. Okay, so that's what the science says. Others really do believe in ghosts. In fact, serious thinkers have talked about the plausibility of people being able to see spirits. Some believers have said perhaps kids see things on a different level than adults. The famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung believed in connection with the paranormal. This is what a biography of him said about the young Jung. He thought that he could hear things walking in the house at the dead of night, and fancied he saw ghosts and other emanations emerging from his mother's room. Our next story is a cautionary tale about messing with the supernatural, lest you curse not yourself but the next generation. Number 1. Don't mess with Ouija boards. Okay, so this story comes from a mom who said she made one big mistake when she was in grade school, and that was messing with a Ouija board, what she called misuse. After playing on that board trying to contact the dead, things started getting weird around her. One night she was babysitting for her young cousin. Before she put the 2-year-old to bed, she did the usual thing and bathed her. While in the tub, the infant suddenly looked panic-stricken. She couldn't keep her eyes off the hallway. This happened on the 3rd floor of the townhouse. And then the dog, a little Pomeranian, just started barking like mad, but barking at nothing in particular. So there she was, looking at an entranced kid in a bathtub, while the dog was going wild over what seemed like nothing. That dog suddenly started growling in the hallway, right where the child was looking. The girl looked around, but she could see nothing. She quickly took the kid out of the bath, and after drying her, she picked her up and took her down to the 1st floor. It was there. She asked her, "What did you see in the hallway?" The kid replied, "The man with the black eyes." She suddenly started becoming entranced, this time on the stairs to the 2nd floor. With her eyes open wide, she concentrated on the stairs. She then slowly raised a finger to her lips, and shaking her head, she breathed the word, "Shh." That babysitter became an adult and had a kid of her own. When she was 5 or 6 years old, he too had a thing about stairs. He hated them, and for good reason. You see, when they stayed over at his grandma's house, he always used to sleep on the sofa in the living room. One day, he told his mom that he didn't want to sleep there another time. She asked why, and he told her that there were too many people walking around. He was scared and he couldn't sleep. She said, "Who, darling? There are no people except you, me, and Grandma." To that, the boy said, "People going up and down the stairs." Those stairs led to an attic, but she couldn't get into the attic without removing a wooden slat. Suffice to say, the woman regrets sitting around that board with a bunch of friends asking, "Is there anybody there?" You're having a conversation with your young son who's only 3 years old. Then he mentions something that makes your blood run cold. He starts talking about the day he died. That's exactly what happened to a man named Dan, whose son seemed to be able to recall, in intricate detail, someone else's final moments. When Dan asked his son to tell him more, the boy described parts of a completely different house to their family home, a green kitchen, a large backyard, and the driveway, the place where the child claimed that he had died. Dan pressed the matter further, and that's when his son told him with an eerie sense of calm that the driveway was where his old dad had run him over with the family car. "It was an accident though, Dad, so it's okay," the young boy told his father, delivering one of the creepiest sentences that Dan had ever heard his child say. But the tale recounted by Dan's son is hardly the only example of this strange phenomena all across the world. There are numerous cultures that believe in the idea of reincarnation, particularly within Hindu and Buddhist traditions. A lot of non-religious people also share a belief in reincarnation, mostly as a means to bring themselves comfort when faced with the inevitability of death. But others believe it's actually possible and even claim to have concrete evidence that they had a past life. It can be easy to brush off a lot of these flimsy stories, or people's recounting of dreams they believe are linked to who they were before reincarnation. But it's another far creepier story when children seem to harbor knowledge of their supposed past lives. Some have recalled details that they couldn't possibly be aware of at such a young age, with a few having even shared memories of places they've never been to before. And in rare instances, the details of these children's stories even align with the deaths of real people. So we've scoured the internet for some creepy stories of people who can seemingly remember their past lives, heading toward the one we think might be the scariest of all: a 3-year-old boy who may have solved the murder of his own past self. Take the son of a woman named Jody, who is having recollections of a supposed past life at only 18 months old. According to the child's mother, he had developed speech surprisingly early, since most babies only speak their first words after the first 10 to 15 months of life. Then again, it's possible that Jody's son had some memory of how to talk left over, or rushed the process because he just had to get some of these unnerving details out. Jody described how her child said he missed his other mother and his older brother, but he seemed also to be aware that he couldn't see them. They wouldn't know it was him, the boy said. He was too young. When Jody asked her son why, he described getting on a motorbike and heading out to the shops to buy a sandwich. According to the child's story, in this supposed past life, he hit a dog while riding the motorcycle, causing him to crash and die as a result. The child reportedly loathed dogs and would even mutter the phrase "stupid sandwich" under his breath a lot. All across the internet, thousands of people have shared stories of creepy things their children have said, or about children they know telling them the details of lives they used to live. Of course, as with a lot of things, just because someone on the internet says something happened doesn't make it true. We're omitting details like the full names of the children or their families to respect their privacy. But we'll leave it up to you to decide whether these are legitimate tales of reincarnation, or just examples of kids saying silly things that coincidentally and creepily line up with the real world. One Reddit user described a similar story about their nephew, who seemed to also harbor eerie and vivid memories of his previous life and family. One day, while babysitting the boy, who was around 3 or 4 at the time, the user recalled their nephew pointing to a refrigerator magnet that displayed a picture of rock formations in the Arizona desert. The nephew asked where the place on the magnet was, and the user told him, at which point the child described that he had used to live near red rocks similar to those in the picture with his, quote, first family. The user's nephew, as is typical in stories like these, then went on to describe in detail the family he had from his past life. According to the boy, his relatives all had straight dark hair, and he had a mother, a father, and a brother. That was until he had wandered too far into the desert one day, at a time too close to when it got dark. The child's tale of their past life concluded with a description of how they died, saying that they'd been eaten by animals that were not dogs, not wolves, but smaller. While they're not typically known to be a threat to humans, Arizona just so happens to be home to coyotes, which are smaller than both wolves and dogs. A lot of these children's supposed recollections are dismissed as purely fantasy, nothing more than an overactive imagination or a child repeating something that they heard an adult talk about, or saw on TV, or perhaps even experienced in a dream. They might claim to remember another family or a different set of parents, a home that isn't the one they currently live in, or even the circumstances of how a past version of them supposedly died. But sometimes there are times when a child's statements line up accurately with the life of a deceased person. Such was the case with one couple whose eldest son was named after a Marine that the husband of said couple had served alongside. One day on a drive toward the husband's sister's house, the couple and their son passed a military base. This just so happened to be the place where the Marine their son was named after had been buried after he was killed in action during deployment. At the time, the couple's son was no older than 3, and the family hadn't taken him to the grave of the Marine he'd been named after. They had never even taken him anywhere near that area where the base was located. But right as they were driving past the site where this soldier had been buried, the couple's son very casually pointed out, "I'm buried over there." This is far from the only story of a child recalling past life of military service. When her son was only 4 years old, Patricia Austrian noticed that the boy Edward had developed a phobia of rainy, overcast days. Hardly something unique to him, of course, as the sound of rain or thunder can often startle small children. But that doesn't explain why, as a child, this one Reddit user reportedly started asking during a heavy thunderstorm, "When do the bombs drop? Are they gone yet?" Unbeknownst to this user, who had grown up in Germany, their grandfather used to alert the city of incoming air raids during wartime. He died 3 days before the user was born, and at the time, they were unaware of their grandfather or either world wars. But back to Edward's case, things started to become strange after he developed his own hang-ups about rainy days. The boy reportedly began to experience severe pain in his throat and complained to his mother whenever he felt it hurting. Specifically, he told her that it was his shot that hurt. Naturally, Edward was taken to the doctor to try to determine the cause for the pain that he was experiencing. However, unable to determine the exact cause of it, doctors decided it would be best to remove the boy's tonsils as a precaution. It was after this happened that Edward developed a new problem. A cyst developed in his throat. Normally, this too would be drained and removed surgically, but the doctors found that the cyst wasn't reacting to usual treatment, leaving them baffled as to what to do. It was then that Patricia asked her son what he had meant when he said his shot was hurting. To her amazement, he started to give a detailed story about wading through mud on a rainy day, describing in frighteningly accurate detail the trenches of the First World War. It was then that Edward told her that on the battlefield he had been killed by a gunshot wound to his throat. The story gets even stranger. After Edward had explained this all to his parents, opening up about his past life and describing how he supposedly died, the cyst that had formed in his throat seemed to disappear. While not impossible for a cyst to clear up on its own without any treatment, this can take months or even years. The doctors were unable to provide a concrete explanation for exactly why Edwards had seemingly vanished or how it had seemed to line up with the story of his apparent death in the trenches. Something similar happened in 2014 when a young boy who we'll refer to as Andrew L. made some statements that truly startled both his parents, to the extent that they believed he might even be possessed by a ghost or some kind of demonic entity. It all started when Andrew, at the age of only 4 years old, began to experience fits of inconsolable crying. Now, it's true that something like that tends to come with the territory when you decide to have children. But what isn't so typical are the unnerving things Andrew was telling his parents when they tried to console him. Upon asking their son exactly what was wrong, his mother recalls him responding tearily with, "Why did you let me die in that fire?" Hearing such an unsettling question coming out of her son's mouth had Andrew's mother, Michelle, convinced that there was a spirit dwelling within the boy. Of course, it could have just been the result of a bad dream or even Andrew play acting. This excuse was thrown out of the window when he mentioned living at a specific address, 860 Main Street in Sumter, Georgia. That was over 840 miles away from where the family lived in Virginia Beach. From there, with her son recalling things that a child his age had no way of knowing, Michelle started researching. She tried piecing together the vague details Andrew was giving, but couldn't find anything concrete. Michelle did, however, manage to reach out to a reality TV show titled Ghost Inside My Child, which ran between 2013 and 2015 and focused on kids who had allegedly been experiencing memories of their past lives. There's been a little debate as to whether the producers of Ghost Inside My Child came up with the eventual story that supposedly linked to Andrew's past life, or if Michelle reached that conclusion without the help of the show. But regardless, everyone seemed convinced that they found a match for the things Andrew had been saying. In October of 1983, there was a bombing attack in Beirut, Lebanon, one that claimed the lives of multiple U.S. Marines. Among them was Sergeant Val Lewis. Apparently, when shown photographs of 6 different Marines who had died in the bombing, the child felt a strong connection to Val's picture. According to the producers working on the show, Andrew kept going back to the picture of Val Lewis even after the cameras had stopped rolling. When prompted, he even referred to the photos of the other Marines as his friends. Some have called into question the legitimacy of Andrew's story, given that in the show itself he parrots back a lot of the same phrases his mother uses, possibly feeling uneasy with the cameras on him. Naturally, the producers of Ghost Inside My Child's primary concern was making a show for TV. And there are plenty of non-scientific ghost hunting shows that rely on lackluster investigations and debunked pseudoscientific methods in order to reach a hasty but definitive conclusion without any loose ends. Still, Andrew's parents took their son's word as confirmation that the source of his apparent past life memories was indeed Sergeant Lewis. The family took Andrew to visit Val Lewis's grave in Georgia, hoping it would provide the young boy with some closure over his supposed past life experiences. Andrew laid flowers at the gravesite and even remarked that another of the graves belonging to another Marine was his friend. However, there are still critics who remain skeptical, pointing out that the show could have done a better job at determining what the source of Andrew's worrying memories of the fire were, rather than jumping to the conclusion that it was Sergeant Val Lewis. This could have been achieved by showing him photos of various different people from different eras. Additionally, despite Andrew's supposed providing Val's Georgia address, none of the show's staff were able to get in touch with the Marine's family. And on top of it all, many worried about the potential repercussions of allowing a small child to believe he's the reincarnation of a dead Marine. That's a profoundly scary idea for a young kid to grapple with, and it's arguably far creepier than the question he had asked that caused this whole rabbit hole to open up. Still, Andrew's story isn't the only time a little boy was widely believed to have been the reincarnation of a deceased member of the military. In fact, people were so convinced by this next story that even the surviving friends of the dead pilot in question believed that 6-year-old James was their fallen comrade reincarnated. From an early age, according to James's parents, Andrea and Bruce, their son loved nothing more than playing with toy airplanes. However, once he reached 2 years old, these were the very things that seemed to plague the boy with regular nightmares. He would wake up screaming, and Andrea even recalled the way he described the dreams he was having. Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out. According to Andrea, her mother was the first to suggest the possibility that these could be memories of James's past life. However, the parents were quick to dismiss the idea, until even more strange details started to present themselves. In one instance, James started going over one of his toy planes as if he was doing a pre-flight check. His knowledge of planes seemed to be way too advanced for a young boy. This surprised his mother when she bought him a new plane with an object that she thought was a bomb on the other side of the toy. Without missing a beat, Andrea's son corrected her, telling her it wasn't a bomb, but a drop tank. Similarly, while watching a History Channel documentary, a narrator referred to a Japanese plane as a Zero, only for James to insist it was called a Tony, the Allied nickname for the plane. In both instances, James was right, even though his parents had never even heard these terms before, and there seemed to be no way that James should know the details like these. He had only watched children's shows, and neither of his parents had been watching anything relating to military history that contained the details he was referring to. Then, his nightmares started to get more intense. Multiple times a week, the boy would be troubled by violent dreams about a plane crash and being shot down by a plane with a red sun on it, a Japanese plane. He began to talk more about it when he was awake. From what he described, it sounded a lot like he'd been a pilot in his previous life. According to his story, his past self had also been named James, who had flown off a ship named the Natoma. The story got much creepier, though, when James's parents looked further into what their son had said. Andrea and Bruce were able to discover that there was, in fact, an aircraft carrier used by the U.S. Navy during World War II called the USS Natoma Bay. And among their squadron was a 21-year-old fighter pilot from Pennsylvania named James Houston, who was killed in action after being shot down by Japanese artillery in Iwo Jima over the Pacific Ocean. That was over 50 years before young James was even born. That might seem pretty conclusive, but not everyone was completely convinced. Desperate to help rid her son of his perpetual nightmares, Andrea contacted a therapist who already believed in the possibility of reincarnation, Carol Bauman. She told Andrea not to dismiss the worrying things James was saying, but to instead reassure him that these things had happened during another life and in another body, and that his parents should remind their son that he was safe for now. This advice seemed to work, and James's nightmares diminished soon after. It's also worth mentioning that the death of James Houston would have been forgotten in history had it not been brought up again by being connected to James's nightmares, whether he truly was the reincarnated pilot or not. But skepticism abounds when it comes to these supposed tales of reincarnation. For one, generally speaking, research into cases like James only really begins after a point where families have already accepted that their child is genuinely a reincarnated person. Plus, it is worth noting that while they might not have watched many Second World War documentaries, James's family had taken him to a flight museum at 18 months old, and this began his fascination with planes, particularly those from the World War II era. It's entirely possible that the specific details he was able to recall had been subconsciously implanted when he was much younger. A lot of what children say is often ambiguous, leaving it open to interpretation. And even James's own father, Bruce, wasn't without his own sense of disbelief, but he considered the information given by his son to be so striking and unusual that it all but confirmed the idea that he had in fact been U.S. Navy pilot James Houston in his previous life. Details of past lives and nightmares certainly have a link in more than just Andrew's story. One online user's father experienced many sleepless nights after they made a creepy statement. While watching a war documentary, the user, a child at the time, reacted strangely to the mention of a tube. "You mean the tube from when I was a grown-up?" When the father asked for a further explanation, he was left wishing he hadn't. The child described being placed in a tube with another person and given a knife. Both were tasked to kill each other, but the supposed past self of the story was stabbed in the chest, a detail that apparently still keeps this user's dad awake at night. That's creepy enough, but another dream, described by a Redditor detailing their past life, might be much more harrowing. They explained that as a young child, they had always used the wrong words for stop and come back. When their parents eventually asked them about it, the child described a reoccurring dream they'd experienced. In this dream, they were a man in their late 20s with a female partner who stood in a long line on a road curving around the edge of a hill. They also distinctly remembered being worried about papers and that there were men in uniforms checking these important documents. As the uniformed men came toward the man that this child seemed to remember being, they heard a gunshot. Grabbing the hand of their partner, they remembered turning to run down the hill, distinctively aware that they needed to get to a nearby river to escape from dogs that were pursuing them. The men in uniforms were also yelling as they gained on the escaping couple, using the same words the child had used for stop and come back. Their dream ended with a man being shot in the back, before everything suddenly went white. Even as a child, they recalled an overwhelming feeling that everything would be better now. The online user recalls that their parents asking about the words they had been using in place of stop and come back. As it turned out, they were check phrases. Much like Andrew's story from earlier, we uncovered another reincarnation tale on Reddit that was surprisingly spurred on by a Navy vehicle. According to the user, they had been watching their friend's son when a large Navy aircraft carrier caught the child's attention. The boy stared at it with a vacant, faraway expression before saying that he remembered when his boat had sank, and that there had been so many sharks. When the user later mentioned the incident to the boy's mother, she simply replied casually stating, "Yeah, he does that sometimes." Hearing a child claim to have died in a war or been eaten by sharks is frightening enough, but another Reddit user reportedly received an ominous statement from her 5-year-old daughter, one that linked to a real personal tragedy. According to the user, one day out of the blue, her 5-year-old had told her that, "I was in your belly twice, Mama. The first time I died before I came out, but I came back." The Reddit user instantly connected this frightening statement to a very real miscarriage she had suffered 8 months before falling pregnant a second time with her daughter. She'd never told this to her 5-year-old daughter, and yet somehow the girl seemingly claimed to have been the reincarnation of the woman's prior unsuccessful pregnancy. You can come across a lot of terrifying tales about possible reincarnations like this over on certain Reddit threads. Of course, that does make it hard to determine exactly which ones are legitimate and which ones are just ploys to garner some coveted upvotes or even some Reddit gold. But occasionally there are those that make our blood run a little cold. And occasionally, even our cynicism gets pierced too. In one such story, a different user describes their son talking about his previous life as a ballerina. Even at a young age of around 3 or 4, the boy seemed to be able to recall in immaculate detail things like the lights, the music, and even the audience's applause during the performances. Then the boy's next words chilled his parents to the bone. "I was at a party on a boat, and I fell into the water, then poof, I was here." Some people online have speculated that this particular reincarnation story is eerily similar to the death of Emma Livry, one of the last ballerinas of the Romantic era, who died all the way back in 1862. However, rather than falling off a boat and drowning thanks to a heavy costume, as some have claimed, Emma Livry actually died as a result of infected burn wounds that were caused when her costume caught on fire thanks to the open flames of candles on the stage. That brings us to one of the strangest of the creepy past life stories we came across. A child who seemed to remember not just one, but 2 of his lives prior to reincarnation, and in both, he wasn't human. A boy in Thailand had such vivid memories of existing as multiple animals before his birth that it even caused him to attack the hunter he thought was responsible for the end of one of his previous lives. Dala Wong, only 3 years old at the time, became the focus of numerous studies after he made claims that he had 2 past lives. In the first of these, the boy said he had previously lived as a deer until he had been killed by a hunter. This is what led directly to the second of the 2 lives Dala Wong seemed to be able to recall, wherein he was reincarnated not directly into a human body, but into that of a cobra. This came to light 3 years after Dalawong was born. As a human child at this time, when he spotted a man at a neighbor's party, the child became enraged and started frantically searching for a weapon with which to attack the adult, which is already creepy enough in and of itself. The man in question was one Mr. Hayu, and Dalawong had never met him before, and neither had his family. Yet the child insisted he had recognized the man. Intervening before any harm could befall Mr. Hayu, Dalawong's mother insisted that her son should explain what was wrong. That was when Dalawong recounted an event that he would have had no way of previously knowing about. Prior to the meeting, Mr. Hayu had an encounter with a cobra, which had been attacked by 2 dogs that he owned. He had stepped in and killed the snake, suffering a bite to the shoulder that left Mr. Hayu with a scar. Later, he took the cobra's remains back home in order to cook and eat it, sharing some of the meat with a friend, a man who, as it turned out, ended up being Dalawong's father. The 3-year-old child's explicit retelling of the snake being cornered by 2 dogs and then being killed and cooked for food was attributed to him having been that very same snake in his previous life. The boy was aware of acute details of the story too, touching Mr. Hayu's shoulder where the man had been bitten, and even being aware that his father had eaten a piece of the snake, which both were able to verify. And the strangest detail in all of this, Dalawong was reported to have suffered from a rare skin condition that left the lower half of his body covered in scales, not unlike those of a snake. While there are many more stories of supposed human-to-human reincarnations, Dalawong's isn't the only human-to-animal one that's been reported. Another boy by the name of Peter supposedly had a memory from a past life triggered when he was given a candy necklace. According to his story, he had been a chimpanzee and described to his mother in detail how he'd been captured in the wild and later brought to a zoo. It was while in captivity that a visitor had thrown a similar candy necklace into the enclosure. Being unsure what to do with the necklace, the chimp threw it back. Another child named Sam seemed to have had memories that linked to the life of his deceased grandfather. His dad, Ron, recalled a particularly creepy incident where, at only 18 months old, Sam asked if he'd had any siblings in his past life. The boy seemed to be aware of his grandfather's sister, despite having no way of knowing about her. Sam told his father that this sister had been turned into a fish by some bad guys. Sam's grandfather had in fact had a sister. She'd been murdered 60 years earlier, with her body being recovered in the San Francisco Bay. One of the better-known stories of reincarnation is that of Ruth Simmons. We've already been over a lot of cases of children saying things that are unnerving about how they died in a previous life. Now, imagine a child speaking in an entirely different voice, one that wasn't their own, but that of their past self. Back in 1952, Ruth Simmons was put under a series of hypnosis sessions, which is often a disputed treatment for dealing with these memories of reincarnation. It's commonly referred to as past life regression hypnosis. However, nowadays, it's not recommended that young children undergo this treatment. When Mary Bernstein, Ruth's therapist, subjected her to past life regression hypnosis, it regressed the young girl all the way back to her birth. Suddenly, Ruth started speaking in a heavy Irish accent, recalling many specific details about her previous life as a woman named Bridie Murphy, who had lived in Belfast, Ireland, during the 19th century. It wasn't possible to verify everything Ruth or Bridie had said, apart from one detail. She recalled buying food from a Mr. Farr and a Mr. John Kerrigan. The Belfast town had a directory from 1865 to 1866, and it lists both men as local grocers. This brings us to arguably the most unnerving of all the reincarnation stories we were able to uncover. In 2014, in the Golan Heights region near the border between Syria and Israel, a 3-year-old boy revealed details of a past life that had actually led to the discovery of a real unsolved murder. The child isn't named in any of the sources we could find, but what is known is that he was part of the Druze ethnic group and sported a long red birthmark on his forehead. This is pretty significant in a lot of cultures around the world, as many hold the belief that a birthmark like the one this child had is a physical representation of how somebody died in a past life. The Druze, it just so happens, also believe in this superstition, considering these birthmarks to be indications of death wounds. As a result, if a child is found to have a mark like this, they are closely observed in case they reveal any potential details about their past lives. If they do, then it's customary in the Druze culture for village elders to take the children to the home they lived in during their previous life when they reach the age of 3. This is provided that they're able to speak, are known to have birthmarks like the boys in the story, and crucially are already able to remember details of their past lives. Sure enough, This young boy had already mentioned something crucial about his past life. He remembered that he was murdered. He didn't fully remember the village he previously lived in, so the elders escorted him through the nearby villages close to where the boy had been born until one started to feel familiar to him. As he was shown around one village, the boy approached a particular house and suddenly found himself able to recall more details about his past life. It triggered memories of him having lived in this specific house, and he even became aware of his old name and shared it with the elders. However, upon hearing it, the elders became troubled. Not only did they recognize the name, but the man the boy claimed to have been was known to have gone missing 4 years earlier. But that wasn't all the boy was able to remember. He also remembered being killed. The man he'd been in his past life wasn't just missing, he had been murdered, and the boy seemed to know his killer's name. The boy confronted the man in question, a man he'd never met before in his life, and confronted him with the accusation. He recited the surprised man's full name, and then the boy told the man he used to be his neighbor. "We had a fight. You killed me with an axe." The accused man immediately turned white, refusing to confess any wrongdoings. But that was when the child told the elders that he could even take them to the exact spot where he had been buried before reincarnation. So fully believing him at this point, after all, the boy had been right so far, the elders let the child take them to where he claimed his body was. There they came across a pile of stones, and sure enough, after clearing the stones and digging a few feet into the dirt, they uncovered human remains. A skeleton had been left there, exactly where the child had said it would be. There was even a murder weapon left behind too, an axe. Upon this discovery, the elders instantly noticed something. The killer had used the axe to leave a deep wound embedded in the victim's skull, a wound that bore a striking resemblance to the boy's birthmark. The man the boy had accused had no choice but to confess to the murder. Creepy, right? Have you ever been grounded for something ridiculous? Well, chances are the rule you broke was nothing compared to the strict rules some parents around the world have. From having to pay parents real money to watch Saturday morning cartoons, to getting grounded over buying too much furniture for your Sims, to having to wear diapers at sleepovers. These are some of the weirdest rules from strict parents around the world. Before we get into the absolutely crazy stories told by people who lived under the roof of strict parents, let's talk about some of the weird general family rules that you probably didn't even know existed in other countries. These aren't just specific to a certain family, but are followed by many households in the country. The craziest thing is that even a rule you might find absolutely wild might be common to a lot of different people. In Vietnam, parents are incredibly strict about a rule related to potty training. In this country, the rule is that you are potty trained by 9 months old, or get scolded by your parents. To put this in perspective, the average child in the United States begins potty training between 18 months and 24 months. Having Vietnamese parents might mean the child will start having strict rules before they even reach age 1. A rule for a child to learn proper bathroom etiquette at 9 months old might seem extreme, but it works for Vietnamese parents. The way they do this is by whistling. Since a 9-month-old can't be reasoned with, and most words don't have meaning yet, this seems to be the best way to enforce the potty training rule. Parents begin by observing when their baby starts to urinate or show signs of needing to go pee. They then make a whistling sound that the baby associates with going to the bathroom. As time progresses, the baby can be placed on a small toilet, and when they hear the whistle, they know it's time to go to the bathroom. The process happens only a few months into the baby's life, but by 9 months old, almost all Vietnamese children are potty trained, which is super young compared to the rest of the world. So perhaps having strict rules about going to the bathroom at such a young age is one the rest of the world should adopt. Sticking with rules for younger children, there is one rule that the Kisii people of Kenya follow that might seem hard to us. Kisii moms have strict no cooing or crying policies for their babies. The mothers tend to take their babies everywhere, but if at any point the child starts to make an unwanted noise, there are strict rules enforced. The Kisii mothers immediately avert their eyes and refuse to look at the baby until the sounds stop. This might seem a little mean to parents in other parts of the world, but eye contact is a sign of power in their culture. By avoiding eye contact, the mother is showing the baby that they do not have power to get what they want by making noise. This rule is strictly enforced and leads to Kisii kids being less needy and more self-reliant as they get older. The next strict rule parents implement on certain Polynesian islands might end up giving you anxiety. The parents on these islands are busy making sure their kids have enough food to eat and a roof over their heads, so they need to work. This has caused the creation of a system based around children taking care of children. There's a sort of childhood hierarchy in these cultures that allow the rules of the parents to be passed down through the ranks of their children. It works something like this. The parents take care of the babies, but once they're old enough to walk, the rule is that they need to start learning skills to help them care for the next baby to come. The initial set of skills a preschool-age child must learn is to calm down toddlers. The older kids watch the younger ones, which teaches self-reliance and responsibility as a child progresses through each age group. These dynamics are strictly enforced not by overbearing parents but by simply stepping back and letting the children work out the best ways to support one another. So although the children watching children rule in some Polynesian communities may seem odd to us, it is strictly enforced, or the whole system would fall apart. Luckily, the parents have help maintaining the status quo from a constant supply of younger kids growing older and new babies being born into the community. And although some people would see this form of childhood upbringing as neglectful, it's been a rule that older kids must take care of younger children for generations in Polynesia. And so far, it's worked out just fine. Some parents have a strict time that their kids must go to bed, but Spanish parents are strict about bedtime in a different way. This flip-flop is so crazy you'll wonder what you missed by going to bed so early as a child. In Spanish families, many social events and family gatherings happen well into the night. This means that one rule for Spanish kids is that they need to be able to stay up late, not go to bed early. In some families outside of Spain, it is not unheard of that kids have a bedtime around 7 p.m. Or if they're really lucky, they can stay up till 8. But in Spain, this is just when things get started. The social connection between family and friends is so important to the culture that the kids need to be a part of it. This means there is a strict no going to bed rule before the party begins. And since there always seems to be a gathering of some sort, children's bedtimes are pushed until much later in the evening for many Spanish families. A more common time for a child to go to bed in Spain would be closer to 10 p.m., and that is on the early side. Parents are firm in their beliefs that children should have a later bedtime to ensure that they can make it through most family gatherings. A 10 o'clock bedtime for a young child may seem wild to many parents from other parts of the world, but it's just a fact of life in Spanish households. You might have been told you weren't allowed to leave the table unless you ate all your vegetables. This might have seemed harsh at the time, but there are parents in one country in particular that takes this rule to a whole new level. Food plays a big role in French culture. It's important not only to the French identity but to the rules in a family household as well. French parents provide their children with strict rules around when they can eat and what they can eat. For example, there are set meal times in France, which means that parents do not let their kids snack throughout the day. They either eat with everyone else or they don't eat at all. Then comes the expectations around what a child should eat. Basically, if it's good enough for adults, it's good enough for children. The rule is that a child will eat what everyone else is eating regardless of if they think they like it or not. The thought behind this rule is that if a kid tries enough things enough times, it'll eventually grow on them. This includes foods like escargot or snails, cristagranula or frog's legs, and every type of stinky cheese you can imagine. French parents require their children to eat these types of foods so they can become cultured. It's not up for discussion in French households. You eat what's put in front of you at mealtime or you go hungry, and this particular rule is likely not going to change anytime soon. As you can imagine, Russian parents can be pretty strict, but there is one rule that children must learn early on or the consequences could be dire. It is considered rude to turn your back on someone in Russia. This means that from a younger age, Russian parents have a rule against turning your back on them or anyone else for that matter. It's much more polite to squeeze past someone facing them than by turning your back to them. This might seem weird if you've ever tried to fit into a crowded train car or slip past someone in a movie theater. It would seem odd to many people if you did these things while facing the other person, as your nose would practically touch. However, in a Russian house, parents make sure that children follow the no turning your back on anyone rule from an early age. It's strictly enforced to ensure that when the child leaves the house, they don't offend anyone by showing them their backside. Parents in this next country have strict rules about which hand their children eat with, and the reason why is a little gross. In many households in India, it's a rule that food should never be eaten with the left hand. It does not matter if the child is right-handed or left-handed. The rule is you only eat with your right hand. Parents in India put this rule in place and strictly enforce it as soon as their children can understand the directions. And India is not the only region to have this rule. Parents in Middle Eastern countries and parts of Africa teach their children to eat food with their right hand from a young age as well. But what is the reason for this? Why do parents in these countries need to be so strict about the hand children use to eat? In some cultures, the left hand is thought of as dirty. The belief is connected to one simple fact. Oftentimes, the left hand is the one used to wipe after going to the bathroom. This rule most likely has its origins in the past when sanitation and good hygiene were not as prevalent around the world. But the rule has persisted, and parents still make sure to enforce it in their households, even though hygienic products are much more common than they used to be. In some Asian countries, there's a rule that everyone must follow before stepping foot into a home. Parents strictly implement the following rule to the point that if a child doesn't follow it, they are not allowed into the house. In many parts of East Asia, it's required that you take your shoes off before entering someone's home. This means that parents are very strict about this rule with their own kids, as they don't want to be embarrassed when visiting someone else's house. It would be seen as disrespectful and disgraceful if their kid walked in with their shoes on their feet. The reason for this is slightly different between countries, but it has its groundings in spiritual and cultural beliefs. Therefore, making sure that children learn to remove footwear before entering a house is incredibly important in many Asian households. Another reason for this rule could be that kids who play outside all day could track in whatever was on the bottom of their shoes. This would make it difficult to maintain the cleanliness of the house. In some cases, parents will even stand in the doorway to ensure that no shoes allowed rule is followed by their children and their friends. Now we're going to move away from the more generalized rules and get into the crazy specifics. Every family is different, and though there are some overarching rules that most parents follow according to their culture, there are some genuinely unique and weird rules that parents have implemented for their children. If you haven't found any of the rules weird thus far, the next one will definitely get you. Many children enjoy having sleepovers. Sometimes they get into trouble or stay up all night, but that isn't a problem for most parents. However, when a strict parent with an odd rule is in charge of several kids, things can get a little weird. One person recounted his childhood in an online discussion. They remember sleeping over at a friend's house and having to follow a rule that was pretty out there. Their friend was a bedwetter and had to wear diapers until he overcame the problem. This was fine, and the friends were understanding of the problem during sleepovers. However, when the friend group went to that kid's house who wet the bed, his parents had a strict rule that made them all a little uncomfortable. All of the kids at the sleepover needed to wear diapers to bed. This was regardless of if they wet the bed or not. This was probably done by the parents to make sure their own kid was comfortable, but it didn't seem absolutely necessary, as at other sleepovers he was the only one wearing a diaper and no one seemed to care. The parents created an ultimatum. Either everyone at the sleepover wears a diaper or everyone gets sent home. This definitely was one rule that was a little bit strange. Video games, television shows, and movies are now hugely popular with kids as technology has become cheaper and more accessible around the world. However, this move toward digital entertainment has caused parents to come up with some pretty weird rules. In some households, there is controversy over particular aspects of pop culture. However, could any parents really be against Pokemon? The answer is yes, but not for the reasons you might think. Many people have recounted not being allowed to play with Pokemon cards or even watch the TV show growing up. This was often due to household rules around too much screen time or spending money on things that were silly. Although if you were one of the lucky kids who got a holographic Charizard and kept it, that Pokemon card could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars right now, so joke's on you, mom and dad. But not everyone was so lucky. Some parents had and still have strict rules around no Pokemon in their house for a more bizarre reason. In parts of the world where people are super religious and hold conservative beliefs, parents won't let their kids engage with Pokemon because it teaches evolution. There's a lot to unpack here, but we'd just like to point out that the evolution organisms go through in the real world and the evolution of Pokemon are two very different things. Most parents try to teach their children that cheating is bad, but there are some who have gone to extremes to get this concept across, especially when it comes to cheating in video games. In fact, one person even recounted online that they were not allowed to use the money cheat in the Sims video game. This cheat gave the gamer an infinite amount of money to build anything they wanted in their virtual house. The person's parents said it wasn't how the real world worked, and therefore, their child would not be cheating in the virtual world either. However, kids will be kids, and they use the cheat code. When their parents saw all the new virtual goodies in their Sims house, they immediately grounded the kid and took away the game. Seems like an odd, over-the-top response to a simple cheat code in a video game, but strict parents will be strict parents. In some households, there are strict rules around watching TV. This single device can lead children to argue, learn about things they aren't supposed to, and even start all-out brawls between siblings. This is why some parents around the world have come up with some very unique ways to mitigate the television problem in their homes. However, a few of the rules around TV time are really weird. Some parents take the payment route. This can be in the form of poker chips with no actual value, or real money that must be cashed in to watch television. There is something strange about taking your kids' money in order for them to watch TV, but some parents believe so strongly in this rule that they will gladly take it even on a rainy weekend when there's nothing else to do. However, some of these weird pay-per-view rules might actually have some benefit. For example, some parents will offer to give their kids more chips or more money to watch TV by doing chores, or kids can even lose their television watching money by misbehaving or doing poorly in school. These incentives might also teach children the benefits of moderation and saving money. Perhaps more parents should be stricter about how much TV is watched, or at least attach some type of monetary value to it. Other parents take a much stricter approach to screen time. There are times and even entire days that electronic devices cannot be used. This might seem like cruel and unusual punishment, but it was not so long ago that smartphones didn't exist. Also, it wasn't always a guarantee that parents could afford a television. So the kids who were lucky enough to have access to them sometimes needed strict rules about how much they could watch. Imagine not being able to look at your phone, stream your favorite movie, or even watch the infographic show on YouTube because you had strict parents. This is the reality in some families on certain days of the week. It would seem that Sundays are the most common day for parents to deny access to any digital entertainment, and although this is becoming rarer, it might be worth trying every now and then. Some parents go overboard with grounding their kids for breaking their crazy rules, and you won't believe what some of these next people get punished for doing. Most parents allow their kids some sort of privacy, however, some people had a strict no closing the door policy on their parents' house while growing up. This could sometimes be taken to the extreme, as the only time their bedroom door would be closed was while someone was changing, and if it was shut any other time, the parents could break in like a SWAT team. One person recounted that they forgot to open the door after changing. Suddenly, their parents kicked in the door and started going through all their drawers and closet. Nothing was left unturned, and when the parents didn't find anything out of the ordinary, the person was still grounded for closing the door when they weren't supposed to. This is obviously an extreme example of a search and seizure by strict parents, but one that's not as uncommon as you might think. Bedroom doors have been used by all sorts of crazy parents who go overboard with their rules. Many people have told stories of lists of rules being nailed to their bedroom doors, just like Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to church doors. There's something to be said about a strict set of rules every day when you wake up. This type of psychological warfare strict parents use to enforce their rules is a little over the top. In some cultures, playing an instrument is taken very seriously. But in certain families, a child playing the piano can be so important to the parents that they invent a bunch of crazy rules around it. Many kids have parents who require them to practice their instrument each day to become proficient. Some parents will let this slide from time to time, but not all. Strict parents have implemented crazy rules, such as for every hour of playing with friends, their kid has to practice the piano for an hour. Imagine what that would look like. A child would come home from school and be exhausted from spending 7 hours in a building learning about different subjects, one of which might have even been music. The last thing they'd want to do is sit down at a piano and practice for hours. However, in order to spend any time playing with their friends, they would need to practice their instrument first. Just thinking about the practice-to-fun ratio involved with this rule is stressful. Although, depending on the child, parents might take an even weirder approach to grounding their offspring. Some parents actually ground their children so they'll spend more time outside of the house. This might seem counterintuitive until you realize what type of kids we're talking about. For example, some children lock themselves in their room to read endlessly or play video games nonstop for hours or even days at a time. This has led to some parents creating rules which force their kids to go outside and spend time with other people in the real world. So it would appear certain strict rules aren't just for keeping children inside the house, but to get them out. And if that wasn't weird enough, some parents have a color-coding system to keep track of their own kids. To be fair, the color-coding system implemented by some households is put in place to try and reduce the amount of fighting between siblings, but this doesn't always work. For example, if your parents assigned you the color green, you would just have a green toothbrush, a green towel, green cups, green bowls, and all your toys would be stored in a green bin. Your brothers and sisters might have other colors, which you would not be allowed to touch. Seems like a good way to stay organized, but in some cases, if the color code was broken, there would be consequences. However, people who grew up this way have said that the strict color rule implemented by their parents helped them become more organized. So maybe there's something to having a specific color and sticking to it as a child. In some households, there are rooms that are off limits. This varies by family, but in at least one instance, a person's grandma had an absurd rule about one of the most important rooms in the house. Everyone needs to use the bathroom, and there were two in this house in particular. However, one was off limits according to Grandma. Anyone could use the first bathroom, but there was hell to pay if you ever stepped foot in Grandma's bathroom. The consequence for breaking the rule was that you would be dead to her. She would literally ban her own family from her house and refuse to speak to them ever again if they entered her bathroom. According to one of the family members, a cousin and their kids, which would be Grandma's great-grandchildren, were all banned from the house because her husband used the bathroom without any knowledge of the rule. The crazy thing was that Grandma refused to forgive the entire family even though no one told the husband, now ex-husband, about the rules of the bathroom. It is unclear if the divorce occurred as a direct result of the craziness of the Grandma's rules, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. In some cases, parents can be completely obsessed with the material things in their homes, and this can lead to some bizarre rules. For instance, there are people who refuse to let their kids or visitors walk on carpets in their home. Instead, strips of plastic or cardboard are used to create a winding path through the house. Everyone must remain on the pathways at all times. Friends that came to visit the house were required to wear special slippers or use the ones that were provided to guests by the parents. There's nothing wrong with wanting to protect nice furniture in a house, but this rule seems a little extreme, especially since even dogs were expected to remain on the walking paths. This crazy strict rule was literally for everyone. Must have been more like visiting a museum than a friend's house when going over for playdates. Imagine your infant child suddenly started talking about piloting warplanes and people dying in balls of flames. Imagine if the kid, only 3 years of age, then mentioned the actual names of the people he'd flown with during the war. You'd likely feel a bit unsettled. Or how would it feel if your child woke up screaming in the middle of the night? For many nights and many weeks, they started rambling about being some Hollywood director from times past. Incredibly, both of these things happened to parents in the US not that long ago. The two kids joined a long list of children who have claimed to have had past lives. And what's fascinating, the children often make a good case. Today, you're going to hear a few more incredible cases of kids that convinced people they used to be another person. To your everyday skeptic, such cases might sound dubious. But before you turn away, you ought to know that thousands of cases of kids who've claimed to have been someone else in another life have been investigated. And we don't mean by online mystics who will tell you for $9.99 how your Aunt Barbara is doing in heaven. Dr. Jim Tucker, professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia, is one such man who's put a lot of effort into trying to find out what's going on with these kids. Since the 1990s, he's been traveling all over the world in search of such kids, and of the 2,500 plus cases he's studied, few of them fail to fascinate. Before we get to some of the most confounding cases out there, first we'll tell you some things Mr. Tucker discovered during his many years of research. For one thing, it turned out that 70% of kids who claim to have lived past lives have lived the life of someone who hadn't had a very natural death, meaning the person had either died from an accident, murder, or they'd taken their own life. Tucker said during research he'd never investigate a case if the parent of the child couldn't name names or give addresses, or talk about how many places the child said he or she had been in their past life. If there was some information to work with, however, Tucker would meet the parents and child and take things further. Tucker might have started off a bit skeptical, but as things have turned out, some children just knew too much. You can't really call this research science. It's more pseudoscience, but still, the kids said some interesting things. They knew who they dated in their past life. They knew what their past wife had loved to do on Sundays. They knew how their past house was decorated, and they talked about the pet dog they so dearly loved. Usually, none of the information was something you could find out online or even in a book. What's also quite interesting, and maybe more convincing in the case for reincarnation, is the fact that most of the kids who claim to have lived past lives are only 2 to 4 years old. In other words, they're not quite at the stage of life where they want to manipulate people. They're also arguably too young to be making up strange stories about people long dead. Let's now look at some of the cases, and later on you can make your own mind up about the validity of the kids' stories. We're going to start with an American kid. What's good about Western cases is they're less frequent in those countries than in parts of Asia where many people believe in reincarnation. As it stands, according to Pew Research, only around 33% of American adults believe a person can come back to life as another person or being. In the UK, some studies have shown 29% of people believe in reincarnation, and in the rest of Europe, the numbers weren't far off. Still, being born again is much more of a thing in most of Asia. In parts of Southeast Asia, such as Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, reincarnation is no laughing matter. It's a fact of life for many people. We'll come to the amazing stories from the East later, but seeing as Americans are for the most part skeptical of life after death, the good old US is a good starting place. The kid's name was Patrick, and in this case, he was investigated by a US psychology professor named Dr. Ian Stevenson, as well as the professor we just talked about. Patrick's mother had called the professors and told them she was convinced he was actually the reborn version of Patrick's deceased half-brother, Kevin. After some more chatting on the phone, the professors took off to the Midwest to talk in detail to the child and mother. They started with the mother. She told them that Kevin was born 14 years before Patrick. He seemed healthy at first, but just before he was 1.5 years old, he developed a strange limp. After a few tests at the hospital, it seemed Kevin was okay, but then, when he fell and broke a leg 2 days later, his mother started to become very worried. She was right to be concerned because as time went on, the doctors discovered that the boy had a form of cancer. One of the areas where he was most affected was his left eye. Kevin began a treatment of chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and after the 10th day in the hospital, he was sent home. This was all very unpleasant, but given the boy's young age, he seemed to smile and laugh as he had always done. 6 months later, he was rushed to the hospital with bleeding gums. Cancer had spread to his bone marrow. Doctors all but said his case was terminal. There was nothing they could do, although he did receive a blood transfusion. He died just a few days later. The mother married again and had another child, but the relationship didn't work out, and some years later she had another child with another man. That child was named Jason. Soon after, she had a fourth child, and his name was Patrick. The mother said as soon as she held Patrick, she just knew he was somehow connected to her first son. The two babies looked similar, even though they had different fathers. Not only that, she soon discovered that Patrick had a problem with his left eye. The diagnosis was a corneal glaucoma, a condition that can make it hard to see. In fact, the kid was pretty much blind in that left eye, as his deceased half-brother had been at the end of his short life. The conditions were not in the same ballpark at all, but blindness in one eye was the same symptom. Not only that, Patrick had a lump on his neck in the same place that his brother had a lump on his neck. It wasn't cancer, just a harmless nodule. But for the mother, these things were just too strange to be true. Things got even weirder when the mother found a kind of dark spot on Patrick's neck in the same place where his brother had a scar from tubes being inserted there. This was a sad story the professors were listening to, but nonetheless they checked the deceased son's medical records. They also checked the body of Patrick, of course, and it all rang true. There were indeed some strange coincidences. What was perhaps freakier is that when Patrick was able to walk, he walked with a limp just as his brother had. When the professors met him, he was already 5 years old, but he still had that unusual limp, even though medically his legs and gait should have been fine. Patrick looked like Kevin. He had a lump and a mark where Kevin had. He limped like Kevin. Okay, so what about Patrick's mind? Did he think he was his dead brother? Well, when he was 4 years old, he started asking his mother if he could go to the other house. He asked again and again to go to this place, a house where he'd once lived. He described it as a chocolate and orange house. His mother, of course, had changed houses as well as husband since her first child had died. Then one day, he asked his mom if he could recall the day he had surgery. At first, she told Patrick that he was healthy and he'd never had surgery, at which point the young boy pointed to his ear, a place where the deceased boy had once had a tumor. The mother kept pictures of Kevin under lock and key, but one day Patrick discovered one and he ran to her and shouted, "Here's my picture, that's me." At other times, he'd talk about a puppy he once had, or should we say his deceased half-brother once had. He even recalled a day he went swimming with his grandfather and others, and a guy's head was dunked under the water. He was referencing events from Kevin's life. You might now be thinking, well, the mother could have made all that up. Sure, that's a possibility. A weird thing to do, but a possibility. The professors interviewed other members of the family, including the mother's sister and Patrick's siblings. They talked about how Patrick would often talk about heaven, although Patrick's father said his kid didn't talk to him about this past life. When the professors talked to Patrick, he told them about this other person he had been, although he did so as if he were with the other kid, not actually the kid. He said he went to the zoo with him and talked about how they'd play in the same bedroom, all the time describing a room that the professors found fitted the description of the dead son's bedroom. Patrick also told them about the time he went to the ranch and saw the bulls, something only his brother had done. Okay, maybe the case doesn't convince you, but keep watching because stranger cases are on the way. Now let's swing over to Thailand, a place where every day people try to please the spirits with bottles of Fanta. This is the case of a boy named Juta, who was 4 years old when his case was investigated. A few months after this kid took his first breaths in the world, his mother's brother died in a motorcycle accident in Bangkok. After that, Juta got very sick and came down with a terrible fever. He also developed two rather strange big spots on his left arm, right at the place where his deceased uncle had a similar marking. The uncle had started to get a tattoo, but after suffering a bit, chickened out. Instead of a drawing, all he had was the start of a drawing, which were two spots. Juta then started calling his own mother Little Noe, which was what her dead brother had called her. Things then got really weird when older folks would go around the house to visit. Juta would talk to the adults using informal language that kids just don't use with grown-ups in Thailand. Not only that, he put ice in their beer and stirred it with his finger, something his uncle used to do. And yes, Thais almost always add ice to the beer. The stuff gets warm there quickly. After the kid had given everyone a glass of beer, he'd take one for himself. He was 4, don't forget. And this wanting of beer happened all the time, something which mirrored his uncle's predilections. Juta also claimed that he once worked in Bangkok in construction. He hadn't even been to Bangkok. All this was heard by the investigators, but when they returned for a second meeting a few months later, little Juta was no longer talking in that adult language and he'd even gone off the beer, refusing one even if one was put in front of him. The spots on his arm were becoming harder to see, and according to investigators, the once grown-up boy had become a normal little boy. Juta's family believed that the soul of the deceased had entered Juta but had now left. The next case is similar but quite a lot more confounding. It was investigated in collaboration between U.S. professors and a professor of clinical psychology at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in India. It's about a woman named Uttara who at the time of the investigation was 33 years old. She had some mental health issues, so had been told to meditate. She did just that. But what happened next surprised her caregivers. She'd alternate between extremes of silence and hysteria, and sometimes start talking in a foreign language even though she couldn't speak any foreign languages. The doctors at the time thought she was speaking Bengali, although her parents told them she couldn't speak a word of it, never mind talk for ages in it. She was sent home, but there were problems, to say the least. She could no longer speak her native Marathi, and instead used her new language, something her parents did not understand at all. Bengali speakers came to the rescue, and they soon told her parents that their daughter was now claiming to be someone called Sharada. It seems Sharada thought she'd never even left Bengal. She didn't recognize people or things around her. It was as if her world was alien to her. In fact, she didn't even know what modern appliances were, like she was living in a time long before such things existed. After a few weeks in this state, Uttara came back. During the investigation, it was revealed that Sharada would make an appearance for a couple of days for a total of 23 times over a few years, each time forgetting who her family was and not understanding how something like a TV worked. Over time, details were collected when Sharada came around. She described the village where she lived in West Bengal, and she described her family and friends. It turned out that she thought she was living in the 18th century. What shocked the researchers is that when they searched for the names of Sharada's alleged father and 6 brothers, they'd all lived in West Bengal in the 18th century in a village like the one Sharada had described. On top of that, professors who were native Bengali speakers talked with Sharada, and they agreed that while she made a few mistakes, she was definitely fluent. Still, skeptics have said that the girl could have somehow secretly learned the language. That rings true when you find out a linguist said her way of speaking was not from the 18th century and her accent wasn't spot on. Was this really a case of a woman suffering from a severe case of multiple personality disorder, or was she really the part-time vessel for a possessor of souls? Let's finish with another story from the West. If you think these kids are all making things up, this tale might change your mind. It's the story of a Scottish boy named Cameron. At the time academics got to hear about this unusual story, he was 5 years old and living in Glasgow. They were told young Cameron believed he had another mother, and she lived a long way off on an island called Barra in the pretty remote part of Scotland called the Outer Hebrides. This island has just over 1,000 people living on it, but it seemed young Cameron thought he was one of them, or had been one of them. When the U.S. investigator arrived in Glasgow, he soon found that at the age of just over 2, Cameron kept asking his mother if they could go to Barra. He seemed obsessed with the place. In nursery school, he'd just walk around all day saying, "I want to go to Barra." So far, there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe he saw a beautiful Barra on TV and he liked the idea of looking for dolphins and whales, which you don't generally see in downtown Glasgow. But it was more than that. The kid talked in detail about his family in Barra. When he was asked about that family, Cameron said his father was named Shane Robertson. Apparently, the boy had been talking about this man from the age of 2.5. Unfortunately, it also emerged one day that Mr. Robertson had been out walking, slipped off a sidewalk, and fallen right in front of an oncoming car. That car, according to Cameron, was of a greenish hue or green and silver. His mother in Barra had long brown hair and it was cut short. He often cried for this woman, sometimes shocking the teachers at preschool when he talked about her. Cameron said he also had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and one of the sisters was named Lindsay, although he couldn't recall all the other names. He said they lived in a big white house and it had lots of bathrooms, so Cameron's Barra family were obviously not short of cash. That house, he said, had lots of boxes outside it. Okay, so we're talking about a really remote place here, an island that can't be too hard to investigate in terms of what families lived there. We're also talking about a wealthy family, likely not your regular fishing family. Cameron gave even more information than that. He said he loved to swim in rock pools and went to the beach a lot. He also said he had a black dog with a white stripe down its chest, and the family would often play with it. He even described using one of those black rotary dial phones. Those things were around most of the 20th century, but you didn't see many of them by 1990. Definitely not in Scotland anyway. What's also important is that Cameron said he often watched planes come into land on the beaches of Barra. Now, Cameron never said he became an adult on Barra, but he also didn't mention anything about his own death. He used to often say that he'd merely fallen through into his new mommy's tummy. He said that one minute he was in Barra and the next minute he was growing up in Glasgow. There he had an older brother who, not surprisingly, soon got tired of hearing about Barra. Everyone who talked to Cameron soon realized he was obsessed. When the researchers talked to him, he wasn't the slightest bit shy as other kids had been during their research. He regaled them with tales of living on Barra, how he loved picking apples and hunting for crabs that always nipped him. He told about his father's black spiky hair, and he said those boxes outside his house he'd mentioned before were full of fish. In conclusion, he said when he was 4, he just fell out of bed, went down a hole, and appeared in his new mom's womb, although he called it a tummy. Okay, so the researchers were now loaded with information, and all they had to do was go to this tiny island and look around. They didn't go alone. They took Cameron and the family. The researchers were both excited but also apprehensive, since some things Cameron had told them didn't match up with some things the mother had said. For instance, he told her the house had stairs, but he told the researchers it was a one-story abode. It's important to note, though, that he first talked about these places just after turning 2, and when the researchers arrived, he was 5. Nonetheless, the professors talked to Cameron's uncle and friends of his mother, and they said his stories were always the same. Maybe he had stage fright now since the camera was turned on him. The only thing to do was set off. They landed there on the beach, which was the landing strip for a very small airport. As soon as the plane opened its doors and young Cameron was blasted by the fresh sea air, he was smiling from ear to ear. It was good to be home, he said. Still, at first, it was hard for the researchers to tell if he really knew the place. It wasn't as if he was still bumping into old friends and marching off to the nearest sweet shop. The team started asking around about a family that sounded like the one Cameron had talked about so effusively. A local historian said since there were so few accidental deaths on the island, he knew about them all. He had all the records going back to a time that seemed applicable to Cameron's descriptions of the island. Only one guy was killed by a vehicle, but the vehicle was a bus and the man wasn't called Robertson. This happened in the early 1950s. The historian also said that he knew of no Shane Robertsons, and while Robertson is a pretty common name in Scotland, there hadn't been so many on Barra. There was one Robertson family there at the moment, but they'd moved there recently. There was also another Robertson family in the 30s. Other things didn't match up. Houses with many toilets were a recent thing on the island. Cameron could have watched planes land, but he'd have to be on the northern part of the island, although he seemed to know the southern part better. Nonetheless, swimming in rock pools was a very popular activity for kids in the past. Was that it though? Did Cameron just have an amazing imagination for a 2-year-old? The researchers were about to give up when the historian called him a few days later. He found a Robertson family that had lived on the northern part of the island. The reason they didn't show up in the records is that when they stayed on Barra, they only did so for vacation periods. And listen to this, this fairly wealthy shipping family had a large white house built for them, and that's where they vacationed in the 60s and 70s. It was built right next to the beach. This house was called Sanderling, and according to some of the older residents on the island, it was often full of kids. Then the researcher and the historian made a breakthrough. They found the address of a man related to the Sanderling Robertsons, and he was still on the island, albeit living in a secluded place. They soon arrived at his house with trepidity and excitement and banged on the door. No answer. The team was about to leave when an old man walked out into the blistering wind and pouring rain, shouting, "I don't know anything, I don't know anything." The cold gust howled as the man retreated back to his house. The researchers knew they would likely not find any more evidence that Cameron, the Glaswegian, had once lived in this rugged island. Cameron was brought to the Sanderling though, and at first the place seemed to mesmerize him, and then he just looked very sad. He walked around the house as if he knew every part of it, and then at one point just stopped and ran to embrace his mother's legs. This is actually what often happens when these kids who claim to have lived past lives are confronted with their past. It emotionally devastates them to be back where they were, or think they were before. In 2018, Prison Policy reported that on any given day, around 53,000 juveniles are locked up in the United States. That's about 5 times more prisoners than are doing time in the whole of Belgium at any age, and actually a bigger number than the adult prison populations in the majority of countries. The US locks up more young offenders than any other nation. Most of these people will go into what in the US are called detention centers, but some might go to long-term secure facilities, others to adult prisons and jails, and others to residential treatment centers. If you've taken an interest in prison TV shows or have been locked up yourself, you'll know that violence is common among young imprisoned offenders. Prison guards have also been said to have crossed the line time and again. Let's now take a look at some of the worst places. We just talked about the USA, and we'll get around to this country, but it's not only there that young offenders will be in for a rough time. Let's look at the UK, a country that used to be home to young offender institutions known as borstals. If you've seen the utterly grim 1979 movie Scum, you'd know that these places were feared. Back then, the authorities took a hard line on offending kids, and borstals were notorious for fighting among offenders and also rampant bullying. The rough treatment by the authorities soon became outdated, but we might ask what replaced these places. According to the Independent newspaper in 2017, what did replace them and what the UK had then was a staggering rise in violence. According to that report, violence, self-harm, and drug use has gone through the roof. It said in 11 months there were 26,000 inmate-on-inmate assaults and 6,844 assaults on staff in just England and Wales. That year, a report by the HM Inspectorate of Prisons said some kids aged 12 to 18 were in their cells 22 to 24 hours a day, sometimes just because of staff shortages. 40% of those kids said they felt unsafe, and many were suffering from depression. What everyone seems to agree on is that reform is needed and needed quickly. But what about the worst place? One notorious place is called Aylesbury Young Offender Institution, but that's only for people aged 18 to 21. The BBC cited a report in 2019 which said some of those youngsters are some of the most disruptive and challenging young men in the prison system. It's understaffed, violence is rife, illegal substances are everywhere, and assaults on guards are up. The same has happened at a place called Parks Prison Juvenile Unit, and there everyone is aged under 18. The BBC reported that many offenders dare not leave their cells. It's also said that 3 out of every 5 young lads felt intimidated by staff, and a third of the offenders said they felt in danger each day. Again, staff shortages and a lack of funds were to blame. In fact, you can read some British media that tell you that youth prisons in the UK are worse than adult prisons in terms of violence. One young offender said this in an interview about how his days sometimes go. So, they're gonna come and smack you up, so you gotta smack them down before they put you down. You're fighting to survive so you don't get wiped out. If you die, you die. That's how it goes. It's perhaps a big indictment of youth prisons in the UK that one prison inspector said a place called Brinsford Young Offenders Institution was the worst prison he had visited in the UK, and he meant including adult prisons. Reformers have asked that this dangerous and squalid center be shut down. Apparently, the level of violence might not be as high here, but many inmates only get 45 minutes to an hour a day outside of their cells. These cells have been called by some reformers unfit for human habitation. This might be why there's been a very high number of inmates self-harming there. In 2018, one critic said this about youth prisons in England and Wales in relation to the spike in violence and self-harm. When numbers of children in prison were skyrocketing, the same narratives were pushed out about children being complex and troublesome. The plain truth is that children respond to appalling living conditions and a lack of sustained expert care. It's time for these institutions to be closed. They cannot be saved. Over in Hong Kong and in one of its youth detention centers, it's another story. Apparently there, it's the guards that mete out the worst violence, with some young offenders in interviews saying that the guards like to play chicken wing and Chinese kale. The first means being told to bow, and then the guards beating the back of the prisoner with their elbows. And the second is getting the same beating but in the most sensitive region of the body for a man. One former inmate of the Lai Chi Rehabilitation Center said guards would just beat them for nothing. He said it was sometimes worse than the violence too, with guards at times doing their best to humiliate the prisoners. This might mean being forced to eat human feces, drink urine, being told no to toilet breaks, or being rushed out of the shower after 20 seconds still covered in soap. They wanted to break the kid's spirit, said the former prisoner. A Hong Kong newspaper wrote about this, saying officers in juvenile prisons tend to use tougher, more violent and humiliating measures to treat the prisoners. Because of this, and because it seems that kids cannot or dare not complain, in 2017 the United Nations Committee report on the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment stated that this needs to be investigated. It seems here the system itself is more to blame for the violence and depravity, not kids fighting among themselves. Now, let's have a look at the USA. With so many youngsters behind bars in that country and with so many gangs, you'd think the places where the young do their time are not so pleasant. This is what someone said about a place called Walnut Grove. A picture of such horror as should be unrealized anywhere in the civilized world. Those are strong words, and Mother Jones wrote a few years back that boys as young as 13 there run a gauntlet of physical and sexual assaults and psychological abuse, including long-term solitary confinement. A federal judge even called the place a cesspool of unconstitutional and inhumane acts. It's been closed since 2016, but we thought we should give it a mention just because of what people said about it. It seems it might have been the very worst place you could find yourself locked up as a young offender. Before it was closed, it had the worst record of sexual abuse in the USA for a youth prison, while guards were said to routinely beat kids, sell drugs, and occasionally spectate at inmate gladiator fights they put on. If you complained, you might find yourself either being beaten or doing a long stretch in solitary. Most kids weren't even in for violent offenses either. To make it worse, after investigating Walnut Grove, the FBI found state officials had been making illegal deals with the private contractors that built the place. The Marshall Project wrote that in the US there are 80 such youth prisons. It said there is one thing you need to know about them, and that is they're harsh, dangerous, and isolated. In that case, it might be hard to pick out the very worst, and we could say it would be hard to beat Walnut Grove in terms of terror. Still, we found numerous reports in recent years that said New York's Rikers Island is one place where young offenders have faced cruelty. Investigations talk about abuse of adolescents and the mentally ill, while the standout case was the beating death of an 18-year-old inmate back in 2008. Worst still, it's said that 2 inmates that beat him to death were part of something called the Program. An investigation revealed that this was a secret society run by correctional officers at Rikers Island to extort and beat other inmates. In 2012, another investigation revealed violence was still used by guards with impunity. Did things change? Well, in 2018, the New York Times wrote that solitary confinement for anyone under the age of 22 was banned. But a way around that was found when some teenagers were just moved to another facility where they could still face isolation. It's particularly bad because reports state that young prisoners are more likely to self-harm or take their own lives while in solitary confinement. The story of Khalif Broder, a young man that took his own life there in 2015, is now well known. Then there's the Lincoln Hills Youth Facility in Irma, Wisconsin, one of the biggest youth prisons in the USA. Several investigations have taken place after what the media called allegations of abuse, neglect, and excessive use of force. One investigation said pepper spray was used regularly on youth prisoners, and so were isolation tactics. We read one report that said this place might be closing, but it seems it's still there. We should say that guards have described many youth detention centers as chaos, and in many youth facilities such as Lincoln Hills, they have been seriously injured. One guard said in a TV interview in 2019 that every second of the job you are in danger. He talked about 16-hour shifts back-to-back with guards under constant and immense stress. He said that Lincoln Hills was underfunded and the young inmates that end up there were the worst of the worst and seen as cases that can't be helped. While a judge ruled that young inmates were subjected to abuse and their civil rights were taken away from them, this 20-year veteran of Lincoln Hills said he never saw such abuse. He also said he knew incidents had happened, but added that they were isolated. He might be right, but you only need to look at the recent scandals in such youth facilities in Texas and Florida to realize some awful things go on. 4 staff members at Gainesville State School in Texas in 2017 were charged with sexual abuse of young inmates. And in Florida, where girls were detained, a similar thing happened the same year. According to one researcher, youths in juvenile detention facilities are at more risk from such predatory abuse than adults are in adult prisons. That research tells us that while in adult prisons being green, new to the prison, presents many dangers, as does gang violence, in youth prisons mistreatment by guards is much more of a problem. Some reports in the US suggest that the facilities we've mentioned are not just bad apples on an otherwise healthy tree. You can look up any number of youth facilities and find allegations of pervasive abuse and subsequent investigations. You can also find guards talking about the intense pressure, long work hours, the constant threat of violence, understaffing, and underfunding. Perhaps what has been created is a perfect storm, a vicious cycle of violence that impacts both inmates and guards. What the USA is trying to figure out, or what must be figured out, is how to stop this cycle of violence. Like in the UK, many campaigners have said because of almost constant violence and civil rights abuses, such facilities need to be closed down. There needs to be an alternative. We should say that all over the US, there have been campaigns against youth prisons, with some reports stating that community treatment programs have been more effective. There is some evidence that someone sent to youth prison instead of an alternative community program is more likely to commit another offense when released. We found some programs in Ohio, Michigan, and New York City that have embraced this. Instead of sending young offenders to rural prisons far from home, these community programs have sometimes been adopted, it seems with some success. But we'd like to know what you think should happen to young offenders and if you think youth prison could be improved. We'd especially like to hear your thoughts if you've been locked up in one of these places or have been a guard or staff member there. Tell us in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, Teenage Death Row Prisoner Who Survived His Own Execution. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.